There is a couch somewhere in your memory. Maybe it is the one from your childhood home, the one with the worn armrest and the cushion that always slid out of place. Maybe it is a couch from a house you have not thought about in years, a house that no longer belongs to anyone you know, sitting on a street that may have changed entirely since you last walked down it. But somewhere in the back of your mind, there is a couch. And on that couch, you are sitting down at the end of a long day. And on the television in front of you, a family is sliding into frame one by one. And a little boy is skateboarding through a town that feels impossibly familiar, even though it has never existed anywhere on any map. You already know the music. You probably hummed it before this sentence was finished. Tonight, we are going to find out where all of that came from. We are going to go back to the very beginning, before the show, before the network, before any of it, to a young man with a sketchbook and a set of characters he had been carrying around in his head for years, without quite knowing what they were or what they were waiting for. We are going to follow the slow, patient, sometimes chaotic journey of an idea as it moves from a doodle on a piece of paper to the longest-running animated series in the history of American television. This is not a mystery. This is not a theory. This is just the story. The quiet, detailed, deeply human story of how a cartoon family came to live inside the hearts of hundreds of millions of people around the world and never left. Get comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the sound of this voice be the only thing that needs your attention. There is no rush tonight. We have a long way to go, and every part of the journey is worth taking slowly. Section 1. The Man with the Sketchbook. Matt Groening before Springfield. To understand where the Simpsons came from, you need to understand where Matt Groening came from. And to understand where Matt Groening came from, you need to cross the Columbia River at the Oregon border, come down through the pine forests and the gray Pacific skies, and arrive in Portland, Oregon, which is the kind of city that in the 1950s and 1960s prided itself on being slightly left of center, slightly removed from the mainstream of American culture, slightly skeptical of anything that felt too polished or too eager to please. Portland was not, in those years, the self-consciously eccentric city it would eventually become. It was simply a mid-sized Pacific Northwest city with a working waterfront and a certain mild independence of spirit that expressed itself mostly in small ways, in the specific quality of its civic conversation, in the way its residents related to the rest of the country, from a comfortable and somewhat proprietary distance. Matthew Abram Groening was born in Portland on the 15th of February, 1954. He was the middle child in a family of 5 children, which is a particular kind of experience that tends to produce a particular kind of person. Middle children are, broadly speaking, observers. They are watchers of the room. They develop early on a finely tuned sense of social dynamics, partly out of necessity, because they occupy no obvious structural role in the family hierarchy, and partly because nobody is paying quite as much focused attention to them as they are to the eldest or the youngest, which means they have both the freedom and the incentive to pay attention to everything else instead. The middle child learns to read the room not because someone taught them to, but because the room is where they live, and reading it accurately is how they navigate. His father was Homer Groening. Sit with that for a moment. The father of the man who created Homer Simpson was himself named Homer, and his mother was named Margaret, a name that can be shortened to Marge. His siblings included children named Mark and Patty and Lisa. And the street where the Groening family lived, the actual, real street in the actual, real Portland neighborhood where Matt Groening grew up and spent his childhood, was called Evergreen Terrace. These are not coincidences. They are not retrospective inventions or pieces of mythology layered onto a story that needed extra color after the fact. Matt Groening has confirmed all of it in multiple interviews across multiple decades. His father, his mother, his family home street, the general atmosphere of that specific domestic life, they all became the raw material for the most famous animated family in the history of television. He did not have to invent Springfield from nothing. He grew up inside a version of it, a quieter and more functional version, but recognizable in its essential textures. Homer Groening Sr. was a filmmaker and a writer and an advertising man and something of a humorist. He had served in the United States Navy. He had worked in various creative fields throughout his adult life. He had a restless, curious mind and a deep and genuine appreciation for absurdity. for the comedy embedded in the specific details of ordinary experience, and he passed all of this to his son through the specific medium of daily family life. The elder Homer had a gift for telling stories that were rooted in the texture of things, stories that noticed the gap between what people said and what they actually meant, and found that gap endlessly worth exploring. Dinner time in the Groening household was interesting by most accounts. Not dramatically interesting, not theatrical, just genuinely engaging in the way that meals can be when the people at the table are paying attention to the world around them and finding it worth discussing. The elder Homer would tell stories from his day. He would notice something absurd in the news, or in the neighborhood, or in his work, and bring it to the table as a kind of gift, something to turn over and examine and find the funny edge of together. This was not performed. It was simply the way the family communicated, the specific language of that particular household, and it seeped into everything Matt Groening would eventually make. Matt absorbed all of this in the gradual, unconscious way that children absorb the atmosphere of the homes they grow up in. It does not happen all at once. It accumulates the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river, invisibly, until one day you notice that the riverbed has changed. He was drawing from a very young age, the way children sometimes are when they feel something that does not quite have words yet. Drawing was a way of thinking, a way of processing the world that did not require the imprecision of language or the social negotiation of speech. You could draw something and it was yours, exactly as you imagined it, without anyone else's interpretation getting in the way. From early on, his drawings had a quality that would become the signature of his adult work. They were simple. They were slightly wrong in a way that felt completely right. The proportions were off in ways that communicated more than correct proportions would have. The eyes were too big or too beady or set too wide apart. The mouths were expressive in a rubbery, exaggerated way that had more to do with emotion than with anatomy. His characters looked like how people felt, not necessarily how they actually appeared. He was not drawing to impress anyone. He was drawing to amuse himself, and sometimes to amuse the people around him, and in that distinction there is something important. Groening never made work that felt like it was trying too hard. The best of his output, from his early underground comics to the earliest sketches that would eventually become The Simpsons, has a casualness to it, a sense that the ideas arrived easily and were put down without too much agonizing. This is partly a stylistic choice and partly a genuine reflection of his personality. He is not, by most accounts, a tortured artist. He is a man who found a way to turn the things he found funny into a living and then kept doing it for the rest of his life. He attended Lincoln High School in Portland, where he worked on the school newspaper and contributed cartoons, and developed what would become a lifelong habit of filling notebooks with drawings and half-formed ideas. He was clever and funny and not particularly interested in the subjects that did not interest him, which is another way of saying he was a fairly normal creative teenager in an era before the internet existed to validate or even categorize that kind of identity. You just were what you were, and you tried to find people who recognized it. After high school, he enrolled at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. The name of the college is another one of those quiet details that eventually gets folded into the mythology of a creative life, sitting alongside the father named Homer and the street named Evergreen Terrace. Evergreen State was, in the mid-1970s, the kind of institution that attracted students who did not quite fit anywhere else, who were skeptical of traditional educational structures and looking for something that gave them more room to define their own relationship to learning. It was progressive and experimental, and notably resistant to the conventional hierarchies of higher education. There were no grades in the traditional sense. Students designed their own courses of study to a significant degree. The campus had an intellectual atmosphere that was comfortable with ambiguity and suspicious of anyone who claimed to have everything figured out. Groening studied philosophy there, or at least he studied the things that interested him, which included philosophy and also literature and also art and also the specific quality of humor in written form. The way that comedy on the page worked differently from comedy in speech and had its own rules that were worth understanding from the inside. He read widely. He drew constantly. He developed, during these years at Evergreen State, the beginnings of a creative philosophy that would shape everything he made afterward. He was interested in the texture of ordinary American life. He was interested in the comedy embedded in the everyday, the small humiliations and small absurdities and small moments of unexpected grace that everyone recognized. but that rarely made it into comics or onto television in a way that felt genuinely honest rather than condescending. He was not interested in satire that punched down, in comedy that made ordinary people the butt of the joke in a way that implicitly flattered its audience for being above it all. He was interested in something warmer and more complicated than that, something that said, look at how strange and funny and difficult it is to be a regular person in America, and do not be ashamed of recognizing yourself in that, because the recognition is the whole point. This is a specific kind of comedy sensibility, and it is not common. Most comedy involves some degree of elevation, some implicit message that the person laughing is, in some way, better than or at least different from the person being laughed at. Groening's sensibility resisted this. His comedy said, I am exactly like this, and so are you, and that is fine and also very funny. In 1977, he moved to Los Angeles. He was 23 years old. He had no particular plan. He had almost no money. He had a sketchbook and a sensibility, and the specific ambition that people with a sketchbook and a sensibility tend to have, which is the ambition to make something, without always knowing exactly what or exactly how. He worked a series of jobs in Los Angeles, the kind of jobs that a young person with a philosophy degree and a portfolio of cartoons tends to work in a city that has not yet figured out what to do with them. He worked at a health food restaurant as a busboy. He drove an elderly woman around the city as a personal chauffeur. He did odd jobs of various kinds. He was not, by his own description, doing especially well in any material sense. The city was large and indifferent and expensive, and he was small and observant and broke, and the combination was not comfortable, but it was generative. It gave him material. Everything gave him material. Los Angeles in the late 1970s was a particular kind of place. The entertainment industry was in one of its periodic moments of creative ferment, the new Hollywood era winding down but still producing work of considerable ambition, the music industry producing a variety of sounds that ranged from arena rock to early punk to the beginning of what would eventually become several decades of pop evolution. The city had the kind of creative underground that sustains itself partly in opposition to the mainstream industry it is adjacent to, the coffee shops and galleries and small venues and independent bookstores and record shops where people who were not yet inside the machine gathered to figure out what they were making and whether there was an audience for it. Groening found this world and found himself relatively comfortable in it. He was the kind of person who fit better at the edges of things than at their center, and the edges of the Los Angeles creative world in the late 1970s were genuinely interesting, full of people who were thinking carefully about what they were doing and why they were doing it and what they wanted from the work. He had started a comic strip called Life in Hell, which he initially self-published and distributed himself by photocopying it and selling it in a local record store on Melrose Avenue called Licorice Pizza. Life in Hell was drawn with the same casual, slightly crooked line that would later define The Simpsons, but its content was darker and more personal, and more explicitly rooted in the specific anxieties of a young man trying to make something of himself, in a city that was indifferent to whether he succeeded or failed. The strip featured a character called Binky, a rabbit with enormous eyes and a perpetually worried expression, a character who inhabited a world that was fundamentally unsafe and slightly cruel, and managed to be in it with a combination of resignation and stubborn persistence. Binky was not a heroic figure. Binky was a figure who endured, who continued to show up, who faced the accumulated indignities of modern life with an expression somewhere between bewilderment and exhausted acceptance. Readers recognized something in this that they had not been offered elsewhere, a comic strip character who looked at the world the way they sometimes secretly felt about it, without resolving that feeling into optimism it had not earned. Later, the strip introduced a pair of characters called Akbar and Jeff, who wore fez hats and were identical to each other and were generally understood to be a gay couple, though the strip navigated this with a deliberate ambiguity that was simultaneously protective and playful. Akbar and Jeff were bickering and affectionate and deeply peculiar, and they added a dimension to the strip that expanded its emotional range considerably. Together, Binky and Akbar and Jeff gave Life in Hell something that most comic strips lacked entirely, the sense of a real inner life, of characters whose comedy was rooted in genuine psychological texture, rather than the collision of simplified comic types. Life in Hell was strange and funny and melancholy, in a way that newspaper comic strips of the era generally were not. The strip dealt with anxiety and loneliness and the grinding realities of low-wage creative work and the general sense that modern life was asking more of people than it was giving back. It resonated with readers who felt the same things but had never seen them articulated quite this way, with this combination of directness and humor that refused to resolve the tension between them into easy comfort. The strip began to get noticed. Alternative newspapers started picking it up. The LA Reader ran it. Then other alternative papers around the country picked it up. By the early 1980s, Life in Hell was running in dozens of alternative papers across the United States, and Groening had found his audience. Not a mass audience, not yet, but a real one, specific and devoted and paying attention. The strip was also collected into books, which gave it a permanence and a portability that the weekly newspaper format could not sustain. These collections, published by Pantheon Books and later by other publishers, found their way into independent bookstores and the general interest shops that stocked the artifacts of alternative cultural life. People gave them as gifts. They passed between friends as a kind of shorthand for a shared sensibility, a way of saying, "This is how I see things. Does this resemble how you see things?" He was not famous. He was not wealthy. But he had built something real. And real things attract real attention. And in 1985, the right kind of attention found him. The call came from James L. Brooks. But before we get to that call, before we talk about what happened when the trajectory of Matt Groening's quiet underground career collided with the professional apparatus of one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood, take a moment, just breathe. Let the images from this first part of the story settle. A young man in Portland with a sketchbook, a father named Homer, a street called Evergreen Terrace, a rabbit with worried eyes, photocopied and sold out of a record store on Melrose Avenue. That is where it all started. That quiet, personal, almost accidental beginning is the seed of everything that followed. And the thing about seeds is that you cannot always tell, looking at them, what they are going to grow into. If you are watching this from somewhere comfortable, drop a comment before you fall asleep. Just your location and the time where you are. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that people in completely different corners of the world are settling in with the same story at the same moment. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribing means you will not miss it. Section 2, Life in Hell and the Years, the strip ran the world. There is a particular kind of success that arrives without fanfare, that accumulates gradually over years through small decisions made by people who are paying attention, and that eventually reaches a point of critical mass without any single moment you could point to and say, there, that was when everything changed. Life in Hell was that kind of success. By the early 1980s, the strip was appearing in alternative newspapers across America, each week reaching a readership that was young and creative and somewhat countercultural, readers who distrusted mainstream media and the mainstream entertainment industry and were looking for creative work that shared that distrust, that spoke from the same slight remove, that found the same things interesting and the same things absurd. These were the readers of the Village Voice and the LA Weekly and the Chicago Reader and dozens of similar papers that had grown up in American cities throughout the 1970s as expressions of a media culture that the mainstream had not figured out how to contain or commodify. Alternative papers occupied a specific and valuable cultural niche. They were free, supported by advertising frequently aimed at the young adult demographic that read them. They ran investigative journalism that mainstream papers would not touch, arts coverage that was longer and more serious than the brief reviews the major dailies had space for, and comics that existed completely outside the conventions that governed what appeared in the funny pages of a daily newspaper. The funny pages had their own strict traditions, their own expectations about length and format and content and tone. Alternative comics had no such restrictions. They could be longer, darker, weirder, more explicitly personal, more politically charged, and more formally experimental than anything that would have survived the editorial process at a family newspaper. Matt Groening's work thrived in this environment because it was perfectly calibrated to it. Life in Hell was literate and slightly cerebral, without being inaccessible. It was funny in a way that required no specific cultural references to understand, no knowledge of current events or television shows or any particular field of expertise. Its humor came from the inside of human experience, from the anxiety and confusion and small indignities that everyone recognized, which meant it could travel. A reader in Boston who had never been to Los Angeles could laugh at a life in hell strip about the cruelty of the job market, or the particular misery of a bad relationship, or the gap between how you imagined your adult life would go and how it actually turned out. The geography was incidental. The feeling was universal. The strip was collected into books, which sold in small but devoted quantities through independent bookstores and the kind of general interest shops that stocked books alongside records and posters and other artifacts of the alternative cultural ecosystem. These collections gave Life in Hell a presence that individual newspaper strips could not sustain, something permanent and holdable and giftable, the kind of book that people gave to friends who seemed like they needed it, who seemed like they were having a hard time, and might benefit from seeing their experience reflected back at them with this particular combination of honesty and dark affection. Groening, during this period, was also developing as a craftsman in ways that were less visible than the strip's growing audience, but equally important. He was learning what worked and what did not, which kinds of ideas held up across a panel-based format and which collapsed under their own weight, how to build a strip to a punchline that arrived at exactly the right moment, how to sustain a character's voice over hundreds of installments without having that voice calcify into mere habit. These are technical skills, genuinely technical in the way that playing an instrument is technical, and they require not just talent but extended practice across many iterations. Groening was developing them through the specific discipline of producing work regularly, week after week, for an audience that had certain expectations and would notice immediately if those expectations were not met. He was also developing, more broadly, a sensibility about what television could be. This is worth dwelling on, because it is not immediately obvious from the outside why a cartoonist who was producing underground comics for alternative newspapers would be thinking carefully about television in the early 1980s. But Groening had grown up with television in the same way that everyone in his generation had grown up with it, as a constant ambient presence, as the background noise of American childhood, and he had developed strong opinions about it. He found most television boring in a way that struck him as unnecessary. Not boring because the medium was inherently limited, but boring because the people making it were making choices that defaulted to the safe and the familiar rather than reaching for the genuinely interesting. He was a devoted fan of certain programs and actively contemptuous of others. He thought about why some shows worked and others failed, which structural decisions created the conditions for good comedy, and which ones foreclosed it before it could develop. He had, through years of thinking about humor and watching it executed well and poorly, developed a fairly detailed set of instincts about what made comedy land and what made it fall flat, and these instincts were useful in ways that would not become clear until the opportunity arrived that required him to apply them. The entertainment industry was not entirely unaware of Groening during this period. Life in Hell attracted the attention of people inside the industry who recognized in it a distinctive creative voice that might be translatable to other media. In 1984, the strip was optioned for development as a potential animated film or television property. The option was taken out by a company with connections to the music industry, and it came with the kind of money that felt significant to a person who had been photocopying his own work and selling it out of a record store. The option did not lead to anything concrete, as most development options do not. But it was an early signal that the wider entertainment world was paying attention. Groening was not discouraged by the option's failure to produce anything. He had learned enough about the entertainment industry by this point to understand that development and production were two very different things, and that the appropriate response to a failed development deal was simply a return to work. He returned to the strip and continued producing it with the same regularity that had gotten him noticed in the first place. He had also, by the mid-1980s, found a significant community in Los Angeles. The city had a creative underground that was not unlike the alternative newspaper world he had been operating in, a network of writers and artists and musicians and filmmakers who were working at the edges of the mainstream entertainment industry, sometimes adjacent to it, sometimes deliberately opposed to it, but always aware of it and thinking about it from whatever angle their particular work gave them. These people were smart and funny and deeply skeptical of the existing culture industry, and they talked constantly about what could be done differently, what the medium they were working in was capable of that no one was currently attempting. what the audience was hungry for that was not being served. Groening was part of these conversations. He was a good listener and a sharp talker, and his years of thinking about comedy in the context of his strip had given him a set of reference points that were useful in these discussions. He knew what he thought. He could articulate it. And when he talked about what made something funny, people listened. Because the evidence was there in the strip, week after week, that he was working from genuine understanding rather than theory. He met people during this period who would matter later. He encountered writers who would eventually contribute to The Simpsons. He developed friendships that would sustain him through the chaos of the show's early development. He built, without deliberately setting out to build it, a network of relationships with people who shared his sensibility and his ambitions and his frustration with the existing landscape of American comedy. That network would prove essential when the moment arrived that required it. The mid-1980s were, in retrospect, the last quiet years of Groening's creative life. After what came next, nothing would be quiet again, or small, or under the radar. The audience he had been accumulating slowly, in alternative newspapers and small-run book collections, was about to be replaced by an audience measured in tens of millions. The conversations he was having in living rooms in Los Angeles were about to become conversations that the entire country was having with itself. But in those last quiet years before the call from James L. Brooks, Life in Hell was doing what it had always done. It was showing up every week. It was being itself. It was refusing to be comfortable in ways that would have made it more widely distributed and less specifically valuable. It was speaking to the people it was speaking to with an honesty that those people found genuinely useful. That, in the end, was what attracted the right kind of attention. There is something worth sitting with in this part of the story. In these years of Groening drawing his anxious rabbit in his apartment and sending the strips out to alternative papers and watching the audience slowly accumulate. Because it is a story about the value of just continuing to do the thing you do. Not in a motivational poster sense. In the practical, unglamorous, daily sense of just showing up and doing the work again, not because success is guaranteed, not because anyone has promised you that the work will eventually reach the people who need it, but because the work is the point, because the doing of it is its own sufficient reason. Most creative careers never get the call from James L. Brooks. Most people who fill notebooks with ideas and send work out into the world and hope that someone is paying attention never receive confirmation that anyone is. Groening received that confirmation, and it changed everything. But the years before the confirmation, the years of work that made the confirmation possible, those years were not wasted or preliminary or merely preparatory. They were the thing itself. They were the making of a person who knew what he thought and why he thought it and how to put it on paper, and that person was what was needed when the moment finally arrived. Section 3. The meeting that changed everything. James L. Brooks and the opportunity. James L. Brooks is one of the most accomplished figures in the history of American comedy. He produced and developed The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is one of the most influential situation comedies in the history of the medium, a show that expanded what was considered possible in network television comedy by insisting on treating its characters as real people rather than comic types, by allowing them to fail and to feel genuinely bad about their failures, and to navigate the messy emotional terrain between what they wanted their lives to be and what their lives actually were. Before The Mary Tyler Moore Show, American sitcoms tended to operate in a mode where the comedy came from misunderstanding or mistaken identity, or the collision of clearly defined comic roles, and in which the emotional life of the characters was largely decorative, serving the plots rather than driving them. Brooks, along with his collaborators, Alan Burns and Grant Tinker and others, had helped dismantle that convention and replace it with something more demanding and more rewarding. The result had been one of the defining television comedies of the 1970s. After The Mary Tyler Moore Show ended, he moved through several other major projects. He created Taxi, which brought the same humanistic sensibility to a very different setting and discovered new things about what comedy could hold. He directed Terms of Endearment in 1983, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture and established him as a filmmaker of considerable weight outside the television world. He directed Broadcast News in 1987. He had, by the mid-1980s, the kind of track record and the kind of industry relationships that opened doors other people spent entire careers trying to reach. He was also, during this period, developing something new. He had an idea for a sketch comedy variety show, a show built around short films and comedy pieces that would be produced with the craft and care usually reserved for theatrical film. The show was going to air on Fox, which was in those years a new and genuinely uncertain entity. Fox had launched as a fourth broadcast network in 1986, an ambitious and somewhat improbable attempt to compete with the three established giants that had dominated American television for decades. The network had money and had acquired stations and had a few pieces of programming, but it was still defining its identity, still figuring out what a fourth network looked like and what it could do that the other three could not. Brooks had a relationship with Rupert Murdoch's organization that gave him significant creative freedom, the kind of freedom that comes when the network you are working for needs you more than you need them. He was developing the Tracy Ullman Show, which was the sketch comedy vehicle that would become the delivery mechanism for what eventually became The Simpsons, though that was not remotely on anyone's mind at the beginning. In the spring of 1987, Brooks was looking for animated short films to use as interstitial content in the Tracy Ullman Show. The segments that ran between sketches were called bumpers, and they were short transitional pieces that gave the show texture and variety. Brooks and his team were exploring what those bumpers could be, when someone on his staff suggested looking at Life in Hell and the cartoonist behind it. The suggestion led to a meeting. Groening, when he got the call about the meeting with Brooks, prepared to pitch a possible animated adaptation of Life in Hell. The strip was his established creative property, the thing he had been working on and developing for a decade, the characters he knew most deeply and the world he had built most carefully. It was the logical thing to bring to a meeting with a major producer who wanted to talk about animation. He arrived at the building with a plan to pitch Life in Hell. And then, in the waiting room, sitting there before the meeting started, he changed his mind. The reason for the change is one of those small creative decisions that looks, in retrospect, enormously consequential, though Groening himself has sometimes described it in fairly practical terms. If he licensed Life in Hell to Brooks and to Fox, he would be giving up certain rights to the strip, the creative property he had built himself and controlled entirely. The characters would no longer belong solely to him. The strip, which was running in newspapers across the country and supporting his life as a working cartoonist, would be entangled in ways that could complicate everything. He had spent years building that property and those relationships, and the idea of handing control of it to a television production was not comfortable. So he invented a new family instead. Sitting in the waiting room before the meeting, he sketched out a cartoon family. A crude, simple, quickly drawn family. A father who was large and somewhat lumpen, with a dome-shaped head and a pronounced overbite. A mother with an improbable hairstyle, hair that rose in a tall blue tower above her head. A son who was spiky-haired and trouble-seeking. A daughter who was earnest and bright-eyed. A baby who was silent and watchful. He named the father Homer, after his own father. He named the mother Marge, which was his mother Margaret's nickname. He gave the children names that, in some cases, came from his siblings, and in other cases simply felt right. The family lived in a generic American city called Springfield, a name that appears on the map in states all across the country, deliberately chosen to be unplaceable, to resist any specific geographic identification. In under an hour, in a waiting room outside a meeting he had not yet had, he had invented the outline of The Simpsons. The meeting went well. Brooks was intrigued by the new family rather than the rabbit characters Groening had been expected to bring. The crude, quick sketches communicated something that the more polished Life in Hell characters would not have communicated. A rawness and an immediacy, a sense that these characters had been pulled directly from the experience of being in an American family without being filtered through too many layers of artistic refinement. They felt real in the way that fast, urgent drawings sometimes feel more real than careful ones, because the hand that made them was moving faster than the conscious mind could fully supervise. Brooks saw the potential. He saw that the family Groening had sketched had the essential quality that he most valued in the projects he chose to develop, the quality of emotional truth embedded in comic situation, the sense that the comedy was not decorating the characters but growing directly from them, that these people would be funny because of who they were, not because of situations imposed on them from outside. He said yes. He commissioned animated bumpers based on the Simpson family for the Tracy Ullman Show. And with that yes, the process began that would eventually produce the longest-running primetime animated series in the history of American television. The process did not begin smoothly. It began, as most genuinely interesting creative processes begin, with a significant amount of confusion about what exactly was being made and how it should look and who was going to make it. The character designs were rough and provisional. The production process was new and required systems that did not yet exist in the form they would need to exist. The people who were going to bring the family to life on screen were being assembled from a creative community that overlapped with Groening's existing network. The production company responsible for bringing the characters to animation was Klasky Csupo, run by Gabor Csupo and his wife Arlene Klasky. They were charged with translating Groening's rough character sketches into actual animated figures that could appear on screen, and this translation involved a great deal of collaborative discussion and iterative work. Csupo and Klasky made decisions about color, about movement, about the specific quality of the character's expressive range, that shaped the visual identity of The Simpsons in ways that would persist long after their direct involvement in the show ended. The yellow skin was decided during this period. The explanation, as Groening and others have described it, is relatively mundane in its origins. The standard flesh tones that animated human characters traditionally used had a tendency to blend into the edge of the television screen in ways that made the characters look as if they were simply floating heads without clear outlines. Yellow, being a color with sufficient visual contrast to differentiate itself from both the background elements of the show's world and the skin tone of the average television viewer watching at home, solved this problem neatly. It was a practical choice that became an aesthetic statement, one of those decisions that looks in retrospect like deliberate genius, but was at the time simply a solution to a technical challenge. The bumpers began production. The family began to develop, and James L. Brooks, watching the early results, began to think that what he had agreed to commission might be considerably more significant than 30-second cartoon bumpers between sketch comedy segments. Brooks himself was, in many ways, the ideal collaborator and advocate for what Groening was trying to create. He had the industry credibility to protect the show from the kind of network interference that kills creative work before it finds its voice. He had the artistic instincts to recognize when something was working and when it was not. He had, crucially, a genuine belief in the project that went beyond commercial calculation and included a real conviction that this family and this world had something important to say, something that American television was not currently saying, about the experience of being in an ordinary American family. He was not wrong about that, but it would take time for the rest of the industry and the rest of the country to understand what he and Groening were building together. It always takes time. The waiting room sketch that became The Simpsons is one of those foundational creative stories that the entertainment industry tends to mythologize, to tell as though the creation of great work is always this kind of lightning strike, this moment of instant inspiration that arrives fully formed and requires only execution. The story of The Waiting Room is true, and it is genuinely remarkable as a piece of creative history, but it is also only part of a larger story. The waiting room sketch was possible because of everything that had come before it, the years of life in hell, the accumulated understanding of how to create characters that felt real on paper, the specific combination of experience and instinct that allowed Groening to produce a rough family sketch and know, even in the moment of drawing it, that these characters could sustain a world. The lightning would not have struck without the years of preparation that made the strike possible. The rough sketches that Groening showed Brooks in that meeting were simple. 5 characters drawn with broad, crude lines, proportions that defied any attempt to map them onto realistic human anatomy. No shading, no texture, no detail. Just shapes that somehow communicated personality. The father's bulk communicating a cheerful, physical haplessness. The mother's improbable hair communicating an aspiration toward dignity that the chaos of her family made difficult to sustain. The son's spiky profile communicating a restless energy that could not be contained. The daughter's neat, simple shape communicating a quiet seriousness. The baby's round face communicating a watchful intelligence that the baby could not yet express in language. Brooks looked at these shapes and saw characters. That is what the right kind of viewer does when they encounter the right kind of work. They see the thing itself, not just the execution of it. Section 4, Building the Family. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie. Every character in The Simpsons began as an instinct and became, over time and through the work of many people, a fully realized human being. or as fully realized as cartoon characters can be, which is, in the case of the Simpsons family, considerably more fully realized than most live-action human beings on American television at the time. Let us start with Homer. Homer Simpson is, at first glance, a fairly simple comic type. He is the bumbling father, the man who means well and succeeds badly, whose desires outpace his judgment, and whose best intentions produce reliably disastrous consequences. This type exists throughout American comedy, in one form or another, stretching back through decades of sitcom and stage comedy, and further back through the older traditions of popular entertainment. The lovable incompetent is not a new idea, but Homer is not quite that. Homer is something more specific and more interesting than the bumbling father type, and the difference lies in the show's insistence on his full humanity, on the gap between who he is and who he dimly perceives himself to be, and on treating that gap with something more than contempt. Homer was drawn from multiple sources. There was Groening's own father, Homer Sr., who shared certain qualities with his fictional namesake: the bluntness, the occasional cluelessness, the deep, if sometimes poorly expressed love for his family. There was also a more general observation about a certain kind of American man, a man formed in the post-war decades, shaped by a particular set of expectations about what a man was supposed to be and what success was supposed to look like, and navigating a world that had quietly shifted those expectations, without quite informing him that they had shifted. Homer wants, in the deep structure of every episode, to be a good father and a good husband. He wants to provide for his family and be respected by them, and to have the life that was implicitly promised to people of his generation and background. He falls short of these things constantly, catastrophically, often hilariously. But the falling short is never the point. The point is the wanting. The wanting is real and identifiable, and the reason the character works at all. The show proved this most clearly in a later season episode involving a wall in Homer's workspace at the nuclear plant. Homer, it is revealed, has covered a motivational plaque that reads, "Don't forget you're here forever," with photographs of Maggie, his youngest daughter, arranged so that the visible letters now read, "Do it for her." That image, simple and wordless and devastating, tells you everything about who Homer Simpson is underneath the stupidity and the selfishness and the thousand daily failures. He is a father. He does it for her. Dan Castellaneta, who would eventually give Homer his voice, understood this. He understood that Homer's comedic failures had to be played against a genuine emotional substrate, a real man underneath the exaggeration, or they would simply be cruel jokes at the expense of stupidity. The voice Castellaneta developed, the slightly strangulated bellow, the rapid transitions from belligerence to confusion to sentimental openness, the specific way Homer says certain words, and the elongated expression of frustrated dismay that became one of the most recognizable sounds in television history. All of this was built on a foundation of genuine character investment. He was not performing a type. He was inhabiting a person. The character evolved significantly between the early rough sketches in that waiting room and the Homer Simpson of the show's golden years. The early Homer was rougher, more aggressive, less emotionally available. He was still recognizably himself, but the edges were harder, the warmth less apparent, the comedy more dependent on his sheer unlikability. As the show developed and the writers found the character, Homer became something more nuanced. He became a man whose considerable flaws coexisted with a heart that was, in the end, genuinely large. The show discovered that the comedy was funnier and the emotional payoffs were more satisfying when Homer was allowed to be, at his core, a person worth caring about even when he was behaving in ways that made caring about him difficult. Homer's relationship with food is one of the show's most sustained comic motifs, and it is worth examining because it tells you something about how the show works. Homer does not merely like food, he loves it with a completeness and a devotion that crowds out more sophisticated responses to experience. When Homer sees a donut, or dreams about a donut, or hears the word donut in a sentence, his face transforms. Every other concern evacuates. The world contracts to the single point of the donut and his desire for it. This is funny. It is also, if you look at it carefully, a portrait of a man for whom the pleasures of the body are the most reliable pleasures available, the pleasures that do not disappoint or confuse or require anything more than presence and hunger. Marge Simpson arrived on the page as a kind of counterpoint to Homer, which is the role she continues to play across the show's entire run. Where Homer is impulse, Marge is consideration. Where Homer operates from immediate desire, Marge operates from careful moral deliberation. Where Homer burns bridges with cheerful obliviousness, Marge tends them with anxious diligence. She is the load-bearing member of the family structure, the person without whom everything would simply collapse. But Marge was, in the early conceptions of the show, in danger of becoming something less than a fully realized character. She was at risk of being the wife as restraining force, the nag, the moral corrective to Homer's excess, a role that would have made her necessary to the stories without making her interesting in her own right. The writers and, crucially, Julie Kavner, who voiced Marge with a specific and instantly recognizable quality that was entirely her own, a slightly husky warmth that communicated both Marge's fundamental goodness and her considerable patience with a world that frequently tested it, gradually gave Marge depths that the early sketches had not suggested. Marge has ambitions. Marge has regrets. Marge made choices, particularly the choice to build her life around her family at the expense of other things she might have done or been, that the show takes seriously rather than dismissing. She is not presented as simply contented with her domestic role. She is shown to have complex feelings about it, to miss things she might have had, to wonder sometimes about roads not taken, while also genuinely loving the life she has built and the family she has built it around. This complexity is what prevents her from being merely a stock character. Her hair is worth discussing, because the hair is famously improbable and has become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in American popular culture. The tall blue tower of Marge's hair, rising to what would be an impossible height in physical reality, was one of Groening's earliest and most enduring visual decisions. He has given different explanations for it at different times. One involves the suggestion that Marge was a late evolution of characters from Life in Hell, her rabbit ears eventually transformed into hair. Whether or not that precise origin story is accurate, the hair became an icon. It communicates something about Marge that no amount of dialogue could quite achieve, something about her aspiration toward a kind of dignity and composed presentation of herself to the world that coexists with the chaotic reality of what her daily life actually contains. The blue of the hair was chosen deliberately. It is an unusual color for hair, visible and distinctive, and it separates Marge visually from the rest of the family in a way that reinforces her role as the stabilizing presence. The rest of the family is in constant motion. Marge is the fixed point around which everything else revolves, and the tall blue tower of her hair communicates this with a visual precision that is quietly brilliant. Bart Simpson arrived as something genuinely new in American popular culture, and the reaction to him confirmed this. He was the first child character in American primetime television to be genuinely and deliberately disrespectful of adult authority without being presented as a problem to be corrected or a lesson to be learned. Bart did not exist to learn lessons. Bart existed to do whatever he wanted and to enjoy doing it and to express, through his total comfort with his own delinquency, something that real children recognized immediately as honest. American children's entertainment, in 1989, was still largely operating in a tradition that had dominated it for decades. Children on television were cute and instructive, and ultimately obedient. They learned things. They grew. They had problems that were age-appropriate and resolved within the span of a single episode in ways that left them marginally wiser than they had been at the beginning. This was the implicit contract between children's television and its audience, a promise that the stories would make the world legible and manageable, that adulthood was a trustworthy destination worth moving toward. Bart rejected this contract entirely. Bart had no particular interest in growing. He had no particular interest in learning lessons. He had a very particular interest in causing trouble and experiencing the immediate satisfactions of a life lived at maximum present tense engagement with whatever was happening. He was not mean. He was not malicious. He was not a bully or a sadist. He was simply a 10-year-old boy who found the restrictions imposed by adults to be largely arbitrary, and who had the wit and the energy and the constitutional indifference to consequences to ignore them as often as he could. Children loved him immediately and completely. Adults were considerably more conflicted. The cultural controversy that Bart Simpson generated in the show's early years was genuine and significant, and it was rooted in a real observation about what the character represented. Here was a child character on primetime television who did not learn lessons, who was not growing toward any identifiable kind of improvement, who was being presented, apparently without irony, as someone children were meant to identify with and perhaps admire. The implicit contract between children's entertainment and its adult consumers was being violated. Nancy Cartwright, who voiced Bart, brought her own specific alchemy to the role. She was an adult woman voicing a 10-year-old boy, which is not unusual in animation, where women have long-voiced young male characters because their vocal range allows them to access a quality of youth that adult male voices cannot reach. But Cartwright did not simply produce a generic child voice. She gave Bart a specific personality that came through in the voice itself. A specific combination of swaggering confidence and occasional vulnerability, of performed toughness and genuine insecurity, that made the character more than his surface coolness suggested. Cartwright has described the audition process for the show as one of the more unconventional she had experienced. She had initially been directed toward the role of Lisa, who was considered the more substantial part, but she found herself more interested in Bart and asked the producers if she could try the role. They agreed. She read the scripts and heard something in the character that she recognized as genuinely alive, and she pursued that recognition rather than the safer strategic choice. The rest of the story confirms the wisdom of following what genuinely excites you, rather than what seems most sensible from the outside. Lisa Simpson is, by many accounts, the character that Groening is most personally invested in. She is the smart one, the earnest one, the one who cares about the things the world would prefer she did not care about, who reads books and plays the saxophone, and has strong opinions about everything from politics to literature, to the environment, to the quality of the breakfast cereal she is being fed on any given morning. She is, in the cold light of sociological analysis, the kind of child who does not have an easy time, who is surrounded by a world that is not quite calibrated for the things she is, and does not always know what to do with someone who takes everything as seriously as she takes everything. She is also, across the show's best years, one of the most emotionally resonant characters in American television, animated or otherwise. The episodes centered on Lisa have a particular quality, a tenderness and a seriousness that the show could afford to deploy precisely because the rest of its emotional palette was so broad. When the show wanted to be genuinely moving, to reach for something that went beyond satire or comedy into genuine feeling, it often did so through Lisa, her loneliness, her hunger for connection with people who understood her, her complicated relationship with a family she loves but sometimes finds maddening, her refusal to stop caring about things even when caring is painful. Yeardley Smith, who voiced Lisa, was the only member of the original cast who was cast in a role roughly corresponding to her own natural vocal register. Smith has a naturally high-pitched voice, and Lisa's voice was built from that starting point, modulated and refined over the show's early seasons into the specific quality it would maintain. There is a vulnerability in the voice that is essential to the character, a quality of genuine feeling that surfaces even in moments that are primarily comic. Smith has spoken in interviews about her complicated relationship with the character, about the ways in which Lisa's intelligence and sensitivity and loneliness have at various points in her own life felt like reflections of her own experience. Playing the same character for 3 decades, watching the world around you change while the character you inhabit remains permanently 8 years old, creates a specific kind of creative relationship that has no real parallel elsewhere in the performing arts. Maggie Simpson does not speak. Across most of the show's run, Maggie communicates through her pacifier and her extraordinarily expressive eyes, and the specific quality of her physical presence in scenes. She witnesses. She observes. She occasionally acts, sometimes in ways that are surprising and decisive, but primarily she is there, the silent member of the family, the youngest and most mysterious, the one whose interior life the show never fully reveals. The choice to make Maggie largely speechless was partly practical and partly artistic. Practically, the difficulty of writing consistent dialogue for a baby character across hundreds of episodes over many years is significant. Artistically, a silent character creates a particular kind of space in a family drama, a character who sees everything without responding to it in the usual ways, who absorbs the chaos of the household without contributing to it, who is the still point in a turning world. Maggie's most celebrated moment in the show's history involves a shooting, a mystery that would eventually become one of the most discussed narrative puzzles in American television, but her power comes from precisely this silence, from what the audience projects onto her blankness and her watching eyes. She is the repository of whatever emotion the viewer most needs to find in the family, the character onto whom the audience's own feelings about family and love and the vulnerability of children can be projected without interference. She is also in the show's emotional vocabulary, the emblem of pure love. Homer's relationship with Maggie has produced some of the show's most genuinely affecting moments. The sequence that is perhaps the most purely sentimental thing The Simpsons ever produced involves Homer's workplace and a simple rearrangement of letters on a motivational plaque and a photograph of a baby. It earned the sentiment it reached for because it had spent years building a picture of a man who was, underneath all of his failures, genuinely devoted to the people he loved. When the proof of that devotion arrived in those 5 words, the audience was ready to receive it. That is what good character work does. It prepares you for feelings you did not know you were going to have. Section 5. The Tracey Ullman Years. Short Films and Early Life. The Tracey Ullman Show premiered on Fox on the 5th of April, 1987, and it was a genuinely unusual piece of television. It was a sketch comedy variety show built around the considerable talents of a British performer who had established herself as a comedic actress of unusual range, able to inhabit characters across an enormous spectrum of class and age and nationality with a physical and vocal specificity that was rare in sketch comedy. Ullman was and is a genuine virtuoso, someone whose skill as a character comedian is so evident that it is easy to take it for granted, to watch her disappear into a character and forget that you are watching a performance at all. The show was designed to showcase that versatility, and it did. Across a run of 4 seasons that produced significant amounts of genuinely excellent comedy alongside the unavoidable patches of lesser material that any sketch comedy show accumulates across a multi-year run. It had a distinctive sensibility, warmer and more character-driven than the aggressive stylistic experiments of Saturday Night Live, more willing to spend time inside a moment rather than rushing to the next joke, more interested in the emotional texture of the situations it created than in the purely mechanical delivery of punchlines. The Simpsons shorts ran between sketches. They were brief, typically somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute, sometimes slightly longer. They featured the Simpson family in short, often physically exaggerated domestic situations, the kind of chaos that a nuclear family produces when you remove the social filtering that keeps it presentable to the outside world. Homer strangled Bart. Bart got hurt in elaborate ways. Marge attempted to impose order on a household that was congenitally resistant to order. Lisa watched with varying degrees of exasperation and affection. Maggie observed everything from her position of silent witness, pacifier working. The animation in the Tracey Ullman shorts was crude by any reasonable standard. It was far cruder than anything that would appear in the eventual series. The characters were drawn inconsistently, their proportions shifting between segments, their colors sometimes off, their movements lacking the fluidity that careful animation produces. The production company responsible for the shorts, Klasky Csupo, was in the early stages of developing the specific techniques and workflows that would eventually become a recognizable and polished style, and the shorts bear the marks of that learning process clearly. But the crudeness was part of the charm, in a way that is difficult to fully articulate but that anyone who watched those early segments can recognize. There was something raw and immediate about the way those early Simpsons looked, something that communicated genuine feeling through imprecision, in the way that a drawing done quickly from observation sometimes communicates more than a carefully rendered finished work. The roughness was honest. It made the characters feel discovered rather than manufactured. The voice cast was assembled during this period. Dan Castellaneta was cast as Homer, and Julie Kavner as Marge. Nancy Cartwright, after her successful pitch for the role of Bart, was cast in that role. Yeardley Smith was cast as Lisa. The chemistry between these performers was evident from the beginning, even in the short format of the bumpers. There was a quality to the interactions between these voices that felt natural, felt like a real family in a way that went beyond technical proficiency, that communicated something about the relationships between these people, that the brevity of the shorts could not fully develop, but that you could feel in the aggregate. The shorts ran for 3 seasons of The Tracey Ullman Show, 48 short films in total, each one a small experiment in what these characters could do, a test of the family's range and resilience and comedic potential. The experiments were not uniformly successful. Some of the shorts are clearly more developed than others. more precise in their timing, more specific in their observation. But across the 48 films, a picture emerged of a family with genuine depth, a family that had specific and consistent qualities that could be reliably accessed and that grew more interesting the more time you spent with them. The audience for The Tracy Ullman Show was modest but attentive. The show never achieved the kind of broad mainstream success that would have made it a genuine hit by the standards of network television, but it found and kept an audience that was specifically and deliberately interested in what it was doing, an audience that included a significant number of people inside the entertainment industry who were paying close attention to the creative experiment in progress. James L. Brooks was watching The Simpsons shorts develop across those 3 seasons with growing conviction that the family was capable of sustaining something longer, something that could use the fuller canvas of a half-hour format to develop the characters and their world in ways that the 1-minute shorts could not begin to attempt. He began, during the 2nd season of The Tracy Ullman Show, to think seriously about what it would take to give these characters a show of their own. There were production discussions and development conversations that ran alongside the continuing production of the shorts, and these discussions involved Brooks and Groening and the people at Fox who were making decisions about the network's schedule and its investment priorities. Fox needed programming. It needed programming that would build an audience and establish the network's identity, and it was in a position where risk was less frightening than it would have been for an established network, because a 4th network with nothing to lose can afford to try things that the 3 established giants would not have attempted. The conversations were complicated by the questions that any animation development raises, questions about budget and production timeline, and the specific challenges of making animation at the volume and pace that a weekly television schedule requires. Animation is expensive. It is slow. It requires enormous amounts of pre-production work before a single frame of finished animation can be produced, and the systems required to sustain a weekly animated series are complex and require careful construction. But the shorts had provided something invaluable: proof of concept. They had demonstrated, across 48 brief films, that the family worked, that the characters were compelling, that the specific quality of The Simpsons' domestic life was entertaining enough to sustain repeated visits and to grow more interesting rather than less as the audience became more familiar with it. The shorts had answered the most fundamental question about any creative project, which is whether the thing actually works when you try to do it. It worked. And in 1988, the decision was made to develop The Simpsons as a standalone series for Fox. The Tracy Ullman shorts exist now as a kind of curious artifact, a document of a creative process in progress, the rough sketches that precede a finished work. They are interesting to watch now not for what they achieved, which was limited by their brief format and early-stage production, but for what they suggest about what was being discovered. You can watch the characters finding themselves across those 48 films. You can watch the voice performers finding their characters. You can see, in the aggregate, the specific qualities of the family that would eventually make the full series work, emerging from the constraints and the roughness of the bumper format. It is the kind of thing you can only see clearly in retrospect, after you know how the story ends. At the time, the people making the shorts were simply making them, working hard to produce brief, funny animated films within the constraints they were given, not knowing that they were building the foundation for something that would outlast any reasonable expectation anyone had for it. That is how most foundational creative work happens. Not with the awareness that it is foundational, but with the simple attention and effort that any good work requires, and the patience to keep doing it until it becomes what it was always going to be. Section 6: Getting a series. The deals, the arguments, the chaos of creation. The decision to develop The Simpsons as a standalone series was made in 1988, and the first season was scheduled to premiere in the fall of 1989, which meant the production had approximately a year to figure out how to make something that had never been made before. This sounds simple in summary. In practice, it was the creative equivalent of building an airplane while flying it, with a full passenger manifest and everyone watching from the ground. Fox had committed to a Christmas special first, a full half-hour Simpsons episode that would air in December of 1989 and serve as a proof of concept for the series. The special, eventually titled Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, was the first full-length Simpsons episode ever produced, and the experience of making it taught everyone involved a great deal about the challenges they had not fully anticipated. The production pipeline for animated television is fundamentally different from the pipeline for live-action production in ways that create specific and significant challenges. A live-action sitcom, once you have the sets and the cast and the crew, can produce an episode relatively quickly. The creative work of writing and the practical work of production overlap in ways that allow adjustments to be made during shooting, and the turnaround from completed script to completed episode can be measured in days or weeks. Animation does not work this way. Animation requires that every creative decision be made before the production process begins, because once you are in production, changing anything is enormously expensive and time-consuming. You write the episode, then you record the voice performances, then you create the animatic, which is a rough version of the episode that sequences the storyboards with the voice track, and only then, once everything has been approved and locked, do you actually animate it. The entire process takes months. This means that the creative team working on a given episode is always working several months in the future, writing and planning and recording episodes that will not air for half a year or more. And it means that the consequences of a wrong decision made early in the process are not apparent until it is extremely difficult and expensive to correct them. Groening and Brooks and the production team learned this the hard way in the early going. Episodes that seemed fine in the script stage emerged from the full animation process looking wrong, feeling wrong, with the timing off or the emotional beats missing or the visual gags not landing the way they had in theory. The correction process was painful and slow. The first full episode took far longer to complete than anyone had budgeted for. There were also, during this period, significant creative disagreements about what the show was supposed to be. James L. Brooks had a very specific vision for what The Simpsons should aspire to, and that vision involved genuine emotional truth alongside the comedy. He believed, based on everything he had learned across a long and distinguished career in television, that the shows that endured were the ones that made you laugh and also made you feel something real, that the comedy and the emotion were not in competition with each other, but were in fact most powerful when they were most deeply intertwined. He pushed constantly for the emotional reality of the stories to be earned and real. Groening agreed with this in principle, but sometimes disagreed about specific execution. He was, as the creator of the characters and the originating visual sensibility of the show, protective of certain things that he felt were essential to what the show was. He did not want the show to become sentimental in ways that felt false, did not want the comedy to be contaminated by a softening impulse that would round off the edges and make The Simpsons into a more conventional television family. Sam Simon, who was the showrunner for the first 3 seasons of The Simpsons, was the third major figure in this creative arrangement, and his role is often underappreciated in histories of the show's development. Simon was a television writer and producer who had worked extensively in the industry before The Simpsons, with credits on shows including Cheers and Taxi. He had a sharp, analytical mind and a genuine gift for comedy structure, for understanding why jokes worked or did not work at a mechanical level, and knowing how to fix them when they did not. Simon was the person who took the energy and the visual sensibility and the character outlines that Groening had created, and the humanistic comedy instincts that Brooks brought, and assembled them into something that could actually function. As a television show, he built the writer's room. He established the production processes. He figured out the specific rhythm and structure of a Simpsons episode, the way the cold open would function, the way the A and B plots would interweave, the way the act breaks would be positioned to maintain momentum across the episode's half-hour runtime. His relationship with Groening was famously difficult. The two men did not get along, and the creative friction between them was real and sometimes bitter and occasionally productive in the way that conflict between talented people with genuine disagreements about important things can be productive. Simon left the show after the 3rd season under circumstances that were not amicable. But his contribution to the show's foundational years was enormous, and the structure he built was robust enough to sustain the show through the many changes that followed. The writer's room that Simon assembled for the first seasons of The Simpsons was one of the most remarkable collections of comedy writing talent that American television has ever produced. These were people who had various backgrounds and various experiences and various specific areas of expertise, but who shared a sensibility, a way of finding things funny that was consistent enough to produce work that felt like it came from a single voice, even when it came from many different people working in a room together. The writers would come in each day and break stories, which is the term for the process of working out the plot of an episode before writing begins. Breaking a story on The Simpsons required negotiating between multiple competing impulses. The satirical, which wanted to use the family as a lens through which to examine some aspect of American society. The character-based, which wanted to deepen the audience's understanding of one or more of the family members. The purely comedic, which wanted to get to the funniest jokes by the most direct route. And the emotional, which wanted the story to earn a real feeling by its end. The negotiations between these impulses played out in the room across hours of discussion and argument and joke testing and scene-by-scene construction, produced episodes that were doing several things simultaneously in ways that made them more than the sum of their parts. An episode could be a satire of the American healthcare system, and a story about Homer and Marge's relationship, and a showcase for Homer's comedic incompetence, and a genuinely moving meditation on mortality and financial anxiety, all in 22 minutes? This multidimensionality was not accidental. It was the result of a particular kind of creative discipline that insisted on not letting any single element of a story overwhelm the others. The network, meanwhile, was watching all of this with a combination of excitement and anxiety that was entirely appropriate given what was at stake. Fox had committed significant resources to the show. If it failed, it would be a significant blow to a network that was still establishing itself. The pressure this created on the production team was real, though Brooks's contractual autonomy provided a buffer between the network's anxiety and the actual creative decisions. Brooks had insisted on creative control as a condition of his involvement, and Fox, needing him more than he needed them, had granted it. There were fights about specific content. There were fights about language. There were fights about what was appropriate for a primetime animated series that was going to air at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights, a time slot that in 1989 was assumed to be a family viewing hour. The network was nervous about some of the material the writers were producing, material that pushed against the conventions of what was considered acceptable in that time slot. Brooks and the production team pushed back, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The Christmas special aired on the 17th of December, 1989. It performed well enough to confirm the network's investment in the series. The regular season, which had been in production simultaneously, was ready to begin. And on the 14th of January, 1990, The Simpsons premiered as a regular series. Everything that followed, every controversy, and every critical triumph, and every cultural conversation, and every year of continued production grew from that beginning. Section 7, Season 1. 13 episodes that introduced a family. The first season of The Simpsons consisted of 13 episodes, a short order by contemporary standards but typical for the era, and entirely appropriate for a show that was still, in many ways, figuring out what it was. The season ran from January to May of 1990, and in the space of those 13 episodes, American television changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. The Christmas special, which had aired the previous December, had established certain things. It had established that the show was willing to deal with subjects, financial stress, disappointment, the gap between what a man hopes to provide for his family and what he actually can, that animated family entertainment traditionally avoided. The special centered on Homer taking a job as a department store Santa Claus after losing his Christmas bonus at work, a premise built around a genuine economic anxiety that millions of American families recognized immediately. He was not simply a buffoon in this episode. He was a man trying and failing and eventually being helped by a moment of genuine luck, and the emotional register of the story was simultaneously funny and genuinely sad in ways that the audience found surprising coming from a cartoon. The regular season continued in this vein, exploring the family through premises that were comic on the surface and something more complex beneath. The first official episode, Bart the Genius, introduced the world to Bart's relationship with Springfield Elementary and with the educational system more broadly. Bart cheats on an intelligence test and is sent to a school for gifted children, where his inability to perform at the expected level produces both comedy and a portrait of a child out of his element, in ways that he cannot explain to the adults around him. The episode established early on that Bart was not merely a troublemaker but a specific kind of troubled child, a boy whose intelligence was real, but who had found no way of directing it toward the things the system wanted it to do. Bart Gets an F examined the anxiety of academic failure with an honesty that was startling for the genre. Bart faces the genuine possibility of being held back a year in school if he fails an upcoming history test. The episode could have been a simple underdog story, the troubled kid studying hard and triumphing through effort, the kind of narrative that makes adults comfortable because it confirms the lessons they want children to learn. The show refused this comfort. Bart studies but not effectively. He prays, he gets lucky. The exam question he feared most is rendered moot by an unexpected snow day that adds time to his preparation, and he passes by a single point. The lesson, such as it is, concerns the role of luck in outcomes that we prefer to attribute entirely to merit. This is an unusual lesson for a children's television show to offer, and it was delivered with such comic precision that most audiences absorb the complexity without necessarily articulating it to themselves. Moaning Lisa gave Lisa her first showcase episode and established what would become a recurring and beloved pattern, a story about Lisa's inner life, about the tension between her sensitivity and the world's indifference to it, that used comedy to approach a genuine emotional core. The episode found Lisa in a depression, unable to explain why she felt what she felt, unable to make the sadness stop by any of the conventional means available to a child. Her mother tells her initially to smile, to present the world with a surface that contradicts her inner state, advice that Lisa follows and that makes her demonstrably worse. Marge eventually reverses this advice, telling Lisa to feel what she feels, to not perform happiness she does not have. It was a startlingly direct piece of writing for a primetime comedy in 1990. The episode ends with Lisa playing her saxophone at a jazz club, alongside a musician named Bleeding Gums Murphy, who becomes one of the show's most poignant recurring characters, a man who has found a way to make music out of sadness and who teaches Lisa that sadness can be a generative rather than merely destructive force. The cultural controversy the show generated during its first season was real and significant. Bart Simpson became a genuine cultural flashpoint, a symbol of something that made a certain kind of adult commentator genuinely uncomfortable. The discomfort was not about Bart's behavior exactly, which was fairly mild by any objective measure, more mischief than genuine malice. The discomfort was about the show's attitude toward Bart's behavior, its apparent lack of interest in correcting him, its refusal to frame his delinquency as a problem requiring solution. Teachers and principals and school administrators around the country wrote open letters and gave press interviews expressing concern about the character's influence on children. Merchandise bearing Bart's face and his phrases was banned in some schools. Parents organized in opposition to what they saw as a character who celebrated disrespect and undermined the authority of the educational system. The specific phrase that circulated through these discussions, and that became a kind of shorthand for the anti-Bart position, was that he was a bad role model, a character whose behavior children would imitate without the fictional consequences that bounded it. George H.W. Bush, then the President of the United States, addressed the controversy directly in a campaign speech, declaring that he wanted American families to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. This comment was widely covered and widely mocked, and the show's writers responded in a way that demonstrated precisely the quality of intelligence that made the show what it was. They incorporated the Bush comment directly into an episode, having the Simpson family watch the speech on television and Bart responding that their family is just like the Waltons in that both families are praying for the end of the Depression. The joke is perfect. It is brief, it is precise, it acknowledges the criticism while simultaneously diffusing it, it treats the president's comment with exactly the respect it had earned, and it demonstrates that the show's writers were operating at a level of cultural awareness and comedic intelligence that the controversy's critics had spectacularly underestimated. Homer's Night Out addressed questions about fidelity and how men see women in ways that were, again, more serious and more direct than the animated format was expected to sustain. When Homer is photographed at a bachelor party dancing with an exotic dancer and the photograph spreads through Springfield, Marge forces him to confront the way he thinks about women and the way his behavior affects his daughter. The episode did not moralize exactly, but it arrived at a genuine moral insight by the end, and it was an early indication that the show was willing to use its comedy as a vehicle for ideas about gender and family and what men owe to the women in their lives. The critical reception to the first season was not uniformly positive, which is often forgotten in the retrospective celebration of the show's early years. There were reviewers who found it too crude, too cynical, too willing to trade on shock value. These critics were not wrong that the show was doing something different from what preceded it. They were wrong in their assessment of what that difference meant. The critics who responded most positively were the ones who recognized that the show's apparent cynicism was actually a kind of honesty, a refusal to pretend that the world was simpler or better than it was, combined with a genuine warmth toward the family at its center that prevented the honesty from curdling into contempt. By the end of the first season, The Simpsons was a genuine cultural phenomenon. It was selling merchandise at a rate that no animated property had previously achieved, a wave of t-shirts and toys and posters and novelty items featuring the family's faces and Bart's catchphrases that flooded the market and became one of the most commercially significant licensing bonanzas in entertainment history. It was being discussed in newspapers and magazines and on radio programs. It was being denounced by school administrators and defended by media critics and analyzed by academics who were beginning to understand that the show was doing something significant in its commentary on American life. The most important thing about the first season, looking back at it from a distance of more than 3 decades, is not any single episode or any particular controversy, but the fact that the show had established, across 13 half hours, that it was capable of sustaining a tone and a sensibility and a level of quality that was genuinely distinctive. Television shows very rarely arrive already knowing what they are. Most shows spend their first seasons finding themselves, experimenting with different tones and different approaches, and settling gradually into something consistent. The Simpsons arrived in its first season with a clarity of purpose that most shows never find at all. That clarity was the result of everything that had come before. The years of life in hell, the Tracy Ullman shorts, the months of sometimes brutal production on the Christmas special, the specific combination of talent in the writer's room, the specific quality of the voice performances, the accumulated experience of everyone involved. The show had been preparing to be made for a long time, and it knew what it wanted to be when the moment finally came. Expansion, the world that grew around the family, secondary characters, and Springfield's soul. No discussion of The Simpsons is complete without spending time with the people who surround the Simpson family, the vast and carefully populated cast of secondary characters who give Springfield its texture and its identity. These are not mere extras. They are not background noise. They are, in many cases, as fully realized and as consistently interesting as the principal family, and the show's investment in them across hundreds of episodes produced something that few television series have managed to achieve. A fictional community that feels genuinely inhabited. Consider Ned Flanders, who lives next door to the Simpson family and who has been, for the entire run of the show, one of its most carefully and consistently observed characters. Ned is devoutly religious, cheerfully neighborly, physically fit, financially responsible, and genuinely kind in ways that the show takes seriously rather than mocking. He is also, as the show gradually revealed across many episodes, a considerably more complicated figure than his surface presentation suggests. The episode Hurricane Nettie, from the 8th season, is the episode in which Ned's complexity is most fully revealed. A hurricane destroys Ned's house. The town of Springfield rallies to rebuild it. The rebuilt house is a disaster, constructed with the careless incompetence that the show's Springfieldians bring to everything they do when genuine attention is not required of them. And Ned, confronted with this inadequate tribute to the care he has always extended to others, snaps. He delivers a speech of accumulated grievance that names every person in Springfield and what they have done to frustrate him, and the speech is simultaneously funny and genuinely unsettling because the anger in it is real, rooted in years of patience with people who have consistently failed to extend to Ned the same consideration he has extended to them. And then, in the aftermath of the breakdown, the show goes somewhere unexpected. Ned is institutionalized, and in the institution, the truth of how he became who he is revealed. Ned was, as a child, genuinely and seriously out of control. His parents, beatnik intellectuals who did not believe in discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years using conditioning techniques to manage Ned's aggression and to replace it with the relentless positivity and patience that the adult Ned displays. Ned's niceness is not innate. It is the result of an extensive behavioral intervention that successfully eliminated his capacity for visible anger while leaving the underlying aggression intact, below the surface, inaccessible by normal means. This is a remarkable piece of character writing. It takes a character who could easily be a one-note joke about religious earnestness and reveals him to be a man whose defining qualities are themselves a kind of trap, a behavioral cage built around a more complex and more volatile interior. The kindness is real, but it is not free. It costs Ned something that the show, at its most honest, acknowledges. And the show uses this revelation to say something about the relationship between Ned and Homer that gives their dynamic a depth that makes the comedy richer rather than simpler. Homer infuriates Ned not only because Homer is lazy and thoughtless and inconsiderate. Homer infuriates Ned because Homer does all the things that Ned cannot allow himself to do, because Homer's id runs free in ways that Ned's has been systematically suppressed. Every time Homer acts on his impulses without consequence, he is demonstrating the freedom that Ned was conditioned out of. And Ned cannot feel this consciously, cannot articulate it, because the conditioning prevents that kind of reflection. So it comes out as exasperated helpfulness, as saintly tolerance, as the endless patient smile that, as the show suggests, the most heroic and the most tragic thing in Springfield. Mo Sislak, the proprietor of Moe's Tavern, where Homer and his friends drink, is another secondary character who accumulated genuine depth across the show's run. Mo is, on the surface, a misanthrope and a failure. A man whose life is organized around a bar that is frequently failing and who has accumulated a catalog of bitterness and disappointment that he makes no effort to conceal from the people around him. He is rude to his customers, which is both funny and structurally strange given that his customers are also his only friends. But Mo has a specific quality that the show allows him in certain episodes, a quality of genuine feeling that surfaces through the misanthropy in unexpected ways and that makes him more than merely a comic type. He has, in various episodes, been shown to have genuine dreams, genuine aspirations toward a kind of life that is better than what he has. And the episodes in which he comes closest to those dreams and then loses them again are among the show's most affecting portraits of ordinary failure. There is an episode in which Mo invents a cocktail that becomes enormously popular, that brings him wealth and success and social recognition, and then loses it again when the origin of the drink is discovered to be a recipe Homer invented years earlier. The episode is funny. It is also, if you are paying attention to Moe's face in the moments when the success is real and the dream is briefly available, genuinely sad in ways that the comedy does not resolve. Moe tastes the version of his life that could have been, and then it is taken from him, and the bar closes around him again, and he is back where he started. The show does not pretend that this is not sad. It is sad. And then the next episode begins and Mo is back behind his bar, and the sadness is not mentioned because Springfield does not mention these things. And that is itself a kind of commentary on the way that ordinary failure is absorbed into ordinary life without ceremony or acknowledgement. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the show's portrait of institutional incompetence, elevated to a level that transcends comedy and becomes something closer to a philosophical position about the relationship between power and qualification. Wiggum is not simply bad at his job. He is bad at his job in ways that suggest he has no real understanding that the job has requirements, that policing involves something other than showing up in a uniform and eating donuts and occasionally arresting people who seem like they might have done something. His incompetence is absolute and cheerful, unmarked by any awareness that there might be another way to approach his responsibilities. This makes him funnier than a more self-aware failure would be, but it also makes him more disturbing, because the cheerful incompetence is in a position of power, because the person who cannot do his job is also the person who carries a gun and makes decisions about who gets arrested and who does not. The comedy of Chief Wiggum is inseparable from the satire of Chief Wiggum, and the satire is real and pointed and rooted in genuine observations about how institutions select and sustain the people who run them. Krusty the Clown, whose actual name is Herschel Schmoikel Pinches Yerucham Krustovsky, is one of the show's most sustained pieces of satirical portraiture. He is a children's entertainer who despises children, a celebrity who regards his fans as an imposition, a professional optimist whose private life is defined by cynicism and addiction, and a deep discomfort with the persona he has been performing for decades. The gap between the painted smile character he presents on television and the desperately unhappy man behind the grease paint is one of the show's most reliable sources of comedy, but it is also one of its more serious observations about the entertainment industry and the cost of performing a version of yourself that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Krusty has a father, a rabbi, who disapproved of his career in entertainment and who refused for years to acknowledge that his son was Krusty the Clown, a character who represents everything the elder Krustovsky found vulgar and unworthy. The reconciliation between father and son, when it eventually came in one of the show's more celebrated episodes, was played with a genuine emotional weight that was unexpected in the context of a story about a television clown, and it demonstrated once again the show's consistent ability to find real feeling in the most seemingly unlikely material. Sideshow Bob, whose full name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., is the most purely theatrical of the show's recurring antagonists, a character whose villainy is performed with the conviction and the relish of a man who has thought deeply about the aesthetics of being evil and decided to commit to them fully. He is voiced by Kelsey Grammer with a resonant baritone and a quality of amused contempt for the ordinary world that makes him simultaneously threatening and inexplicably endearing. He is a graduate of Yale University. He is an accomplished classical musician. He considers Bart Simpson to be his nemesis, which raises the question of what it says about a man that his primary adversary is a 10-year-old boy. The Bob episodes are among the show's most formally ambitious, constructing genuine thriller plots with real suspense alongside the comedy, plots in which Bart is genuinely in danger and the audience genuinely does not know whether he is going to escape. This is unusual for a comedy. The willingness to generate authentic tension rather than comedic approximations of it, and the show's ability to make it work is evidence of the quality of the writing and the performing in these episodes. Bob's repeated failures to kill Bart, and his repeated returns despite these failures, gave the show one of its most durable running gags and also one of its most interesting ongoing character studies. The gap between Bob's evident intelligence and sophistication and his inability to defeat a 10-year-old boy is funny in a way that also says something about the limits of intelligence as a form of power, about the ways in which the very sophistication that makes Bob interesting also makes him unable to adapt to a world that is messier and more random than his careful planning accounts for. Springfield itself, the town that contains all of these characters, deserves recognition as a character in its own right. The town is not simply a setting. It is an environment that shapes the people who live in it, and that has its own specific qualities, its own recurring dysfunction, its own way of responding to crises that is as consistent and as characterful as anything the principal family does. Springfield responds to crises by forming mobs. This is not a general observation about human nature. It is a specific observation about Springfield's specific community psychology, the tendency toward collective action that is simultaneously decisive and misdirected, that channels real feeling and real energy into responses that have nothing to do with the actual problem and that frequently make the problem worse. The mob scenes in The Simpsons are among the show's funniest recurring motifs, and they are also among its most pointed satirical observations because they are recognizable in a way that is slightly uncomfortable because the impulse toward collective rage that the show is mocking is an impulse that exists in real communities and has real consequences. Springfield also has a specific relationship with its own history that the show explores across dozens of episodes. The town has a complicated past involving founding stories that are disputed, civic monuments that commemorate events that may not have happened as officially described, and institutions that were built on principles that subsequent history has complicated. These details accumulate across episodes into a portrait of a community that is, like all communities, the inheritor of decisions it did not make and the occupant of a history it did not choose, trying to maintain a coherent narrative about who it is and where it came from in the face of evidence that the narrative is more contested than the official version suggests. This is, of course, also a portrait of America, the country whose specific combination of genuine idealism and genuine failure the show is always examining. Springfield is America in miniature, and America is Springfield writ large, and the relationship between them is the subject of the show's satire across its entire run. Section 8, The Golden Age, Seasons 2 through 8. The term Golden Age is used cautiously in discussions of long-running creative works, because it implies a later decline that is sometimes contested and sometimes painful to acknowledge. But in the case of The Simpsons, the term is generally applied to the period running roughly from the 2nd through the 8th seasons, and its application is not seriously disputed among the people who care about the show's history. These were the years when the show was operating at a level of sustained creative achievement that has rarely been matched in American television, animated or otherwise. Season 2 began in October of 1990 and ran through July of 1991. It was, by general consensus, a significant step up from the already strong first season. The writers had spent a year learning the show, learning what it could do and how to do it, and the confidence that comes from that kind of extended learning process was evident in the work. The episodes were tighter, the jokes were sharper, the emotional beats were more precisely placed. The show had found the specific calibration of comedy and feeling that would define its best years. Bart Gets His Grade, the second season premiere, opened with Bart in danger of being held back a year in school if he failed his upcoming history exam. The episode ends with Bart passing by a single point, aided partly by an earthquake that extended his preparation time, and then crying in private when he realizes that passing means leaving behind certain friends who did not. That moment, brief and quiet and placed near the end of an episode that had been primarily comedic, was the show declaring that it understood its characters and was not afraid of what it found in them when it looked closely. Dead Pudding Society pitted Homer against his neighbor Ned Flanders in a miniature golf competition for their respective sons, and in doing so revealed something about Homer's relationship with Ned that would sustain one of the show's most enduring comic dynamics across decades of episodes. Homer hates Ned. He hates Ned specifically and thoroughly, and in ways that are entirely about Homer, rather than about anything Ned has actually done. Ned is good. Ned is kind. Ned is successful and competent and genuinely loving toward his family. And all of these qualities infuriate Homer because they implicitly illuminate Homer's own failures in every category. The comedy of their relationship is driven entirely by this dynamic, and Dead Pudding Society established it with a clarity that made every subsequent Homer versus Ned episode feel like a continuation of a story whose terms were already fully understood. The second season also introduced supporting characters who would become essential to the show's world. Sideshow Bob, introduced as Krusty the Clown's sidekick and quickly revealed as a villain of considerable intelligence and ambition, became one of the show's most beloved recurring antagonists. His first full episode, Krusty Gets Busted, was also a Bart showcase, a mystery story in which Bart solves a crime that the adults around him cannot, and which established both Bob's specific quality of menace and Bart's specific quality of perceptive intelligence when he is genuinely motivated. The third season deepened the show's world considerably and introduced several of the episodes that would later be cited among the best in the series' history. Flaming Moe's told the story of a drink that Homer invented and Moe stole, and that brought fame and success to Moe's Tavern before the truth came out. And it managed to be funny and melancholy and sympathetic to both Homer and Moe simultaneously, which was a level of emotional complexity that the show was only possible because the characters had been established clearly enough that their feelings about the situation were both legible and genuine. Bart the Murderer began with Bart accidentally stumbling into a position of influence within the Springfield mob, a premise that should have produced only comedy but that the show managed to use to say something genuine about the appeal of power to a child who has very little of it in his official life. Season 4 is often cited as the single strongest season in the show's history, a run of 22 episodes with a consistency of quality that most television shows never achieve at any point in their run. Consider the list of episodes in that single season: Camp Krusty, A Streetcar Named Marge, Homer the Heretic, Lisa the Beauty Queen, Treehouse of Horror 3, Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, Bart's Friend Falls in Love, Brother from the Same Planet, I Love Lisa, Duffless, Last Exit to Springfield, and Marge versus the Monorail, among others. Every one of these episodes is doing something specific and doing it well. Most of them are doing something that had not been done quite that way before. Marge versus the Monorail is worth examining in some detail because it is in many ways the show's most perfect expression of its satirical range and its comic ambition. The episode, written by Conan O'Brien, concerns the arrival in Springfield of a charismatic con artist named Lyle Lanley, who sells the town on the idea of building a monorail despite the town having no need for one and no capacity to operate one. The premise is drawn explicitly from The Music Man, the musical about a con artist who sells a fictional town on a band program it cannot sustain, and the episode acknowledges this parallel directly in ways that add a layer of self-awareness to the satire. But the episode is more than a parody of The Music Man. It is a sharply observed meditation on the way communities are susceptible to charismatic salesmanship, on the ease with which the desire to be special and important can override the ability to think critically about whether something makes sense. Springfield wants the monorail because a monorail sounds exciting and progressive, not because Springfield has a transportation problem that a monorail would solve. Lanley understands this and exploits it with a precision that is both funny and slightly unsettling. The villain's method requires his victims to cooperate, and the episode observes this without letting Springfield off the hook. The town gets the monorail it deserves because it was too excited about the idea of being the kind of town that had a monorail to stop and ask whether a monorail was actually a good idea. Last Exit to Springfield is the episode that many critics and scholars of the show have identified as the single best episode of the series. It concerns Homer's accidental elevation to the position of union representative and his inadvertent success in negotiating against Mr. Burns, who wants to eliminate the dental plan from workers' benefits at the nuclear plant. The reason the dental plan matters, the emotional engine of the plot, is Lisa's need for braces. Homer becomes the defender of his co-workers' benefits, not because he has any ideological investment in labor relations, but because losing the dental plan would mean his daughter cannot have the orthodontic care she needs. The episode is simultaneously a sharp parody of labor management conflict, a loving reference to Citizen Kane, a showcase for Mr. Burns' specific brand of evil, a character study of Homer's peculiar kind of competence that emerges only when he cares about something deeply and personally, and a genuinely moving story about a father's devotion to his daughter. It does all of these things in 22 minutes without any of them feeling crowded or underdeveloped. It is the show operating at its absolute peak, every element in perfect balance. The comedy and the feeling and the satire and the character work all serving each other simultaneously. The fifth season maintained the quality of the fourth across almost its entire run and added several episodes that deepened the show's emotional range. Cape Fear brought Sideshow Bob back in a film parody that managed to generate genuine suspense alongside its comedy, a combination very few television comedies attempt and even fewer achieve. Homer's Barbershop Quartet built an entire alternate history for Homer around the story of a brief musical career, using the premise to deliver a full and loving parody of the Beatles' mythology. Rosebud explored Mr. Burns' one surviving piece of genuine feeling, his childhood teddy bear, in ways that made him both more sympathetic and more terrifying by revealing the specific moment at which everything human in him was extinguished. Seasons 6, 7, and 8 continued to produce work of extraordinary quality, though the concentrated consistency of seasons 3 through 5 was beginning to show the very first signs of the eventual diffusion that would follow. The storytelling was occasionally more willing to prioritize the comic set piece over the emotional grounding. The satire was occasionally more interested in its own cleverness than in the human story it was supposed to be illuminating. These were small signs, barely perceptible in the context of the brilliant individual episodes that continued to appear throughout these seasons. Who Shot Mr. Burns, the two-part Season 5 finale and Season 7 premiere, demonstrated that the show could construct a genuine dramatic mystery with the structural complexity of a Agatha Christie novel and the comedic intelligence of its best work simultaneously. The mystery, in which virtually every character in Springfield has a motive to shoot the town's billionaire employer, was constructed with careful internal logic and resolved in ways that still generate debate about whether the official answer is correct. The summer of 1995, between the first and second parts of that mystery, was a period when The Simpsons occupied a cultural position it had not held since the early days of Bartmania. The national contest to guess the shooter, the Fox promotional campaign, the America's Most Wanted tie-in treating the fictional crime as a real unsolved case, all of this made The Simpsons, for a few months, genuinely central to American popular culture in a way that transcended its normal audience. People who did not watch the show regularly were discussing it. People who had never seen a single episode had opinions about who had shot Mr. Burns. The golden age ended somewhere around the 9th season, depending on who you ask. The original writers' room had largely dispersed, its members moving on to other projects. The production process had industrialized in ways that were inevitable given the show's longevity. but that made the kind of concentrated creative focus that had produced the best early seasons more difficult to sustain. The show continued, and it would continue for decades, and it would continue to produce episodes that reached the standard of its best years, but not consistently and not with the concentrated density of quality that the first 8 seasons had established. That it lasted as long as it did was remarkable. That it produced what it produced during those years was genuinely historic, a sustained creative achievement in American popular entertainment that has few precedents and no real successors. Expansion. The relationship between The Simpsons and the culture it came from. The Simpsons did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a specific cultural moment, at the intersection of several trends in American comedy and American culture that had been developing for years, and that the show, in certain ways, brought to a point of crystallization. The 1970s and 1980s had been decades of significant change in American comedy, driven by several forces simultaneously. Saturday Night Live, which premiered in 1975, had established that a weekly television show could operate with the sensibility and the aesthetic priorities of the countercultural comedy underground rather than the mainstream entertainment industry, and it had built a large and devoted audience that was specifically interested in comedy, that was self-aware, that understood it was performing for an audience that had grown up on television and movies and knew the conventions of those forms, that was willing to be uncomfortable in ways that comfortable entertainment was not. The stand-up comedy boom of the 1980s, fueled partly by cable television and partly by the expansion of the comedy club circuit, had produced a generation of performers who were developing a style of observational comedy that was specifically rooted in the texture of ordinary American life. This style, sometimes called observational comedy, sometimes simply associated with the specific performers who were doing it, was built on the recognition that the most fertile ground for comedy was not the extraordinary, but the ordinary, not the exotic or the dramatic, but the specific quality of daily experience that everyone shared and that no one had thought to examine quite this carefully. Steve Martin, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Eddie Murphy, Jerry Seinfeld, Roseanne Barr, all of these performers, in very different ways and with very different sensibilities, were working in the space between performance and observation, using comedy to say something about what it was like to be a person in America at a specific moment in its history. The specific things they were saying varied enormously. The approach, the commitment to finding comedy in the texture of real experience rather than in the mechanics of comic setup, was a shared undertaking. The Simpsons drew on all of this and synthesized it into a form that the animated family sitcom had not previously accommodated. It brought the self-awareness and the cultural literacy of the Saturday Night Live tradition into the domestic space of the sitcom. It brought the observational specificity of the stand-up comedy boom into the narrative structure of episodic television. It brought the emotional honesty of the best dramatic television of the 1980s, the quality that Brooks had been developing across his career, into a format that had previously resisted genuine emotion in favor of comedic simplicity. The synthesis produced something new, something that had not quite existed before in American television, a show that could be simultaneously funny and serious and satirical and warm and self-aware without any of these qualities overwhelming the others. A show that operated in multiple registers simultaneously because the people making it understood each of those registers and had thought carefully about how to hold them together. This is what distinguished The Simpsons from the other animated shows that followed in its wake. It was not the first adult animated show. It was the first adult animated show that had figured out how to use the specific capabilities of animation to say things about American life that no other form could say in quite the same way, and it was the first to do this with the level of craft and the level of commitment to genuine quality that made what it was saying worth hearing. The show's timing was also significant. 1989 was a year of considerable cultural ferment in America. A year when the specific combination of economic anxiety and political disillusionment and cultural restlessness that had been building throughout the Reagan years was finding various outlets and expressions. The Simpsons was one of those outlets, a place where the frustration with the gap between official America and actual America could be acknowledged and processed through comedy. Homer's work at the nuclear power plant under a boss who could not remember his name, was not merely a comic situation. It was a portrait of a specific kind of American working life, the life of a person who is essential to the functioning of the organization that employs him and entirely invisible to its leadership, who contributes every day to the production of something that he could not fully understand and over which he has essentially no control, who is kept in place by a combination of inertia and necessity, and the specific exhaustion that comes from doing a job you did not choose, for reasons you did not design. This was, and is, the experience of a significant portion of the American workforce. The show depicted it with a combination of comedy and honesty that the people living it recognized immediately, and that recognition was part of why the show found its audience so quickly and held it so deeply. The show was also, though this is less often discussed, a product of a specific Los Angeles creative community at a specific moment, a community whose values and sensibilities and specific ways of finding things funny shaped the show in ways that are visible to anyone who has spent time in that community. The particular combination of Jewish comedy tradition, West Coast counterculture, literary ambition, and deep familiarity with the conventions of film and television that characterize the people who made the show is visible in the work, and it is not accidental. The show emerged from a community of people who had grown up watching television and who thought carefully about what they were watching, and who had developed strong opinions about what television was capable of and what it was failing to do. These were people who came to the show not as television professionals first, but as people with things to say first, who happened to be using television as the medium through which to say them. This quality, the sense that the show was made by people who genuinely had something to say, rather than by people who were primarily interested in the production of television, is one of the things that distinguish the early seasons from the later ones, and that distinguish The Simpsons from most of what surrounded it on the schedule. You could feel the intelligence and the investment and the genuine commitment to quality in every well-made episode, the sense that the people who made this cared about it in ways that went beyond their professional obligation. Expansion, the specific episodes that changed everything. Certain episodes of The Simpsons have a status in the show's history that goes beyond their individual quality, that represents something like turning points or crystallizations of what the show was at a specific moment. To understand the show fully, you need to spend some time with the specific episodes that other episodes are measured against. Homer the Heretic is a Season 4 episode that addresses Homer's relationship with organized religion through the premise of him skipping church one Sunday and finding the experience so pleasant that he resolves to stop going entirely. While his family is at church, Homer stays home, makes his own breakfast of whatever he wants, watches football, and discovers, to his considerable surprise, that the Sunday he spends alone without the obligation of church is the best Sunday he can remember. He takes this as a sign that God wants him to stop going to church and stay home. The episode does something interesting with this premise. It does not present Homer's position as simply wrong or as simply right. It allows God to actually appear to Homer in a dream and to engage with him on the question of whether religious observance is necessary for genuine faith, a conversation that is both funny and genuinely theological, that takes the question seriously rather than using it merely as a setup for jokes. And the episode ends not with Homer returning to church in a conventional reconciliation, but with a genuine peace between Homer and God that does not require the institutional mediation of organized religion. This is unusual. American entertainment rarely takes religious questions seriously enough to engage with them at this level of specificity, and it almost never comes down on the side of the individual's direct relationship with the divine over the institutional form of religion. The Simpsons did this, and did it in a way that was both funny and genuinely respectful of the question it was asking. Lisa on Ice is a Season 6 episode about sibling rivalry, about the specific way that competition between brothers and sisters can reveal and strain the love that underlies it. Lisa has been failing gym class and discovers that she has a natural talent for ice hockey. Bart is the established star of the school hockey team. They end up on opposing teams, their natural sibling conflict given a formal structure and an audience, and the show builds to a confrontation between them that the entire town of Springfield has invested in emotionally. The episode's ending, in which both Lisa and Bart choose to let the game end in a tie rather than try to defeat each other, choosing their relationship over the competition, is one of the show's most purely sentimental moments. It works because the episode has done the work to establish what their relationship actually is, the genuine love underneath the genuine irritation, the way that the person who annoys you most because they know you best is also the person you need most because they know you best. The sentiment is earned. Bart Sells His Soul from the same season is an episode that asks a genuinely philosophical question through the specific lens of Bart's character. Bart, as a prank, declares that the soul is not real and sells his to his friend Milhouse for $5. And then, over the course of the episode, Bart begins to notice that something is different about him, that without his soul, he has lost access to something that was providing something he cannot quite name or replace. Animals do not respond to him. Automatic doors do not open for him. The world has become subtly but persistently alien in ways that Bart cannot explain through any of the categories available to a child who does not believe in souls. The episode ends with Bart getting his soul back, restored to him by Lisa in an act of love that is itself an argument about what souls are and where they live. But what the episode actually argues, quietly and without stating it explicitly, is that whether or not the soul is a metaphysical reality, the capacity for genuine feeling and genuine connection is real and valuable and something that can be lost through carelessness, something that needs to be cared for, that choosing cynicism costs you something that is not easily recovered. This is a remarkable piece of writing for a network television comedy aimed at a general audience. It is the kind of writing that the show produced regularly in its best years, the kind that looked like entertainment and was entertainment, but that was also doing something more demanding. That was asking the audience to think about something real through the specific and funny and human-scale situation it was presenting. These episodes are not outliers. They are representative of a quality that ran through the best years of the show like a thread, a quality of genuine engagement with genuine questions through the specific medium of comedy about a cartoon family in a fictional American town. The comedy was real. The questions were real. And the combination of the two was something that most entertainment does not attempt, and most of what attempts it does not achieve. Section 9, the people behind the voices, the principal cast and their stories. The voice performances that define The Simpsons are not merely the actors playing characters, they are the characters. The relationship between the voices and the characters they give life to is so intimate, so thoroughly established over decades of work, that it is genuinely difficult to imagine the Simpson family as separate entities from the people who speak for them. The voice is the character is the voice. This is the nature of long-form animation, but in the case of The Simpsons, the bond has been sustained for so long and with such consistency that it has achieved a quality that goes beyond professional relationship into something closer to permanent fusion. Dan Castellaneta was born in Oak Park, Illinois, in 1957 and came to the entertainment industry through theater and improvisational comedy. He had been a member of the Second City Company in Chicago, which is one of the most important training grounds in American comedy, a place that has produced an extraordinary number of the most significant comedy performers and writers of the last 50 years. The Second City tradition is built on improvisation, on the specific skills of finding comedy in the moment, responding to what is actually happening rather than executing a predetermined plan, and building scenes through the kind of mutual awareness and responsiveness that makes collaborative performance something more than the sum of its individual contributions. Castellaneta brought these skills to the voice work on The Simpsons in ways that are not always visible in the finished episodes but that are essential to their quality. The specific quality of Homer's voice, the way it moves through registers of exasperation and enthusiasm and confusion and genuine feeling, did not emerge fully formed from the first recording session. It developed over time through the specific kind of attentive performance that comes from deeply inhabiting a character, from being willing to try things and discover what the character reveals under the pressure of a given scene. The voice that became Homer's signature was partly drawn from Walter Matthau, as Castellaneta has described in interviews, a connection visible in the weary resignation and the slow-burning exasperation that characterize both performers. But the Homer voice was also substantially invented through the recording process, through doing the character enough times to find what the character needed, rather than what a general impression of a certain kind of man would require. Homer is not a type. Homer is a specific man. The voice had to be specific too, and the process of making it specific required the kind of patient, iterative work that produces genuine character rather than mere performance. Castellaneta also performs several other regular characters on the show, including Grandpa Simpson, Krusty the Clown, Groundskeeper Willie, Barney Gumble, and Mayor Quimby. The range required across these characters is significant, not simply in the technical sense of producing different vocal qualities, but in the more demanding sense of finding genuinely different comic sensibilities for each character, different rhythms and different emotional registers that make each feel like a real and distinct person rather than a variation on a single comedic type. Krusty has the specific desperation of a man who became famous for making children happy and has never quite understood why that left him feeling empty. Grandpa has the rambling, tangential quality of a man whose present has become so impoverished that he can only find richness in a past that no one else remembers. Willie has the operatic self-pity of a man who takes every indignity personally and yet cannot stop making himself available for indignities. Julie Kavner was born in Los Angeles in 1950 and had established herself as an actress before The Simpsons through her work on the sitcom Rhoda, where she played Brenda Morgenstern, the sister of the title character, and for which she won an Emmy Award. She is, by most accounts, a private person who gives relatively few interviews and prefers to let her work speak for itself, which is an entirely reasonable position for someone whose work speaks as clearly as hers does. The voice she developed for Marge, that distinctive husky warmth, was partly natural and partly developed through the recording process. There is something in the voice that suggests a person who has more feelings than she usually expresses, who contains more than she shows, who has learned to present a calm and composed surface to the world while managing a considerable interior complexity. This quality, embedded in the voice itself, is what makes Marge more than a comic foil. It is what makes her feel like a real person who chose, or found herself choosing, this particular life, and has found ways to be genuinely satisfied by it while also genuinely aware of what it costs. Kavner also performs the voices of Marge's sisters, Patty and Selma Bouvier, who are played with slightly harsher versions of the same vocal quality, the warmth drained out and replaced with a particular kind of resigned bitterness that the show uses for comic effect while also acknowledging its roots in genuine disappointment. Patty and Selma are women who made different choices from Marge and are not entirely sure their choices were better, which gives their constant passive aggression toward Homer a quality that is more complex and more sympathetic than it would otherwise be. Nancy Cartwright came to the role of Bart from a background in animation voice work. She was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1957, and had studied with Daws Butler, one of the most celebrated voice actors in the history of animation, the man behind Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound and many of the most iconic cartoon voices of the mid-20th century. This training gave her a deep familiarity with the specific techniques of cartoon voice performance, the way timing and energy and physical commitment to the performance translate into animated characters in ways that differ significantly from live-action acting. She initially read for the role of Lisa rather than Bart, and found Bart more interesting and more alive with comic possibility. She asked the producers if she could try the role. They agreed. The story of that audition has become one of the more frequently told in the show's history, partly because it illustrates something true and important about the creative process, that the best choices are often the unexpected ones, the ones that follow genuine enthusiasm rather than strategic calculation. Cartwright gave Bart a specific combination of swaggering confidence and occasional vulnerability, of performed toughness and genuine insecurity, that made the character more than his surface coolness suggested. The swagger was real, but it was a defense, and Cartwright found ways to let the defense slip in key moments that gave those moments an emotional authenticity that simple comedy could not have produced. Yeardley Smith was born in Paris in 1964 and grew up in Washington, D.C. She came to The Simpsons from a background in theater and a small number of film and television appearances. Her voice, naturally high and slightly breathless, became Lisa's voice with relatively little alteration, which meant that among the principal cast, she has the most direct correspondence between her natural vocal quality and the character she plays. She has spoken in interviews about her complicated relationship with the character, about the ways in which Lisa's intelligence and sensitivity and loneliness have at various points in her own life felt like reflections of her own experience, and about the particular feeling of having played the same character for 3 decades. of having grown from a young actress into a mature woman, while the character she plays has remained 8 years old. The gap between her life and Lisa's creates a specific kind of creative tension that she has described as both challenging and sustaining. The challenge of meeting a character where she always is, even as you yourself are somewhere different, and the sustaining quality of having that consistency, that fixed point, across the changes of an entire adult life. Hank Azaria is one of the most technically accomplished voice actors in American television, a performer of such range and precision that the list of characters he has played on The Simpsons reads like a roster for a small and very strange city. He was born in New York City in 1964 and trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. He voices Apu, Chief Wiggum, Professor Frink, Comic Book Guy, Mo Sizlak, and numerous other recurring characters, each with a distinct vocal identity built from a combination of precise technical observation and genuine creative invention. His work as Mo, the bartender, is particularly notable. Mo is one of the show's most emotionally complex supporting characters, a man of genuine feeling trapped in a life that has consistently failed to recognize or reward what is best about him, a misanthrope whose misanthropy is a defense mechanism against a sensitivity he cannot afford to display. The voice Azaria gives Mo, a hoarse growl with occasional surprising notes of vulnerability pushing through, is a complete characterization, telling you everything about who Mo is and how he became that way without requiring any explicit exposition. You hear Mo speak and you know his whole history. The controversy surrounding his portrayal of Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon has been significant and genuine. The 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu raised serious and substantive criticisms of the character, arguing that the portrayal, a non-South Asian actor performing a broadly accented South Asian character, had contributed to a specific kind of stereotyping that had real negative effects on the South Asian American community. The criticism was taken seriously by Azaria himself, who publicly apologized in 2021 and has spoken at length about what he wished he had understood and done differently during the years he performed the role. The show retired Apu from a central role. The conversation that followed the documentary was one of the more substantive discussions of representation and voice casting in animation that American popular culture has produced. Harry Shearer rounds out the original principal cast. He was born in Los Angeles in 1943 and has had one of the most varied and distinctive careers in American comedy, including his foundational work with Spinal Tap, the mock documentary about a fictitious heavy metal band that he created with Christopher Guest and Michael McKean, and his long association with Saturday Night Live. He voices Mr., Burns, Smithers, Principal Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Dr., Hibbert, Otto, and many others. His work as Mr. Burns is a masterpiece of sustained comic characterization, a voice built on careful observation of a specific human type, the aged and powerful and completely detached from ordinary human experience, inflected with a precise quality of menace that is always slightly theatrical, always slightly aware of itself as menace, which makes it funnier than purely realistic villainy would be. Burns does not simply threaten people. He announces his threats in the language of a man who has been threatening people for so long that the language itself has become a kind of pleasure for him, a performance he delivers to an audience he imagines appreciates it. His Ned Flanders, a character who could easily be a one-note joke about religious earnestness, is played with such genuine warmth and such carefully calibrated sincerity that Flanders became one of the most beloved figures in the show's enormous cast. The comedy of Ned comes not from mockery of his faith or his goodness, but from the gap between his goodness and the world he inhabits, which consistently fails to reward it. Shearer understood this from the beginning and played Ned accordingly, with the result that the character became something more interesting than a target and more affecting than a saint. The 6 principal performers have been remarkably stable across the show's extraordinarily long run. There have been contract disputes, most notably in 1998, when the cast negotiated a significant increase in their per-episode fees in a negotiation that at various points appeared to threaten the show's continuation but was ultimately resolved. There have been reports of varying degrees of creative satisfaction at different points in the show's long history. But the cast has stayed together in a way that is genuinely unusual for a production of any kind, let alone one that has run for more than 3 decades. The longevity creates its own peculiar quality. These performers have been voicing these characters for so long that the boundary between the performer and the character has become, if not exactly indistinct, at least very interesting to think about. Castellaneta has been Homer Simpson for his entire adult professional life. Smith has been Lisa Simpson since she was in her mid-20s. The characters have grown with the performers in ways that the characters on screen do not show, because the characters do not age, but the performers do, and that accumulated life experience flows back into the performances in ways that are subtle and genuine, and probably impossible to fully articulate. The characters are the voices. The voices are the characters. And after 3 decades, the people who produce those voices have become, in some essential and perhaps unrepeatable way, the people those characters are. Section 10. The writers who made Springfield real. A television show is, at its foundation, a writing achievement. The sets and the cameras and the actors and the music and the editing all matter enormously, but the writing is where the experience originates, where the decisions are made that determine everything else. This is particularly true of The Simpsons, where the voice performances are recorded from scripts before the animation begins, which means the writing is literally prior to every other element of the finished product. What the writers decide is what the show is. What they do not decide cannot be in it. The writer's room of The Simpsons during its golden years was a place of unusual creative concentration. The room was populated by people who had arrived from different backgrounds and different places, but who shared a particular kind of intelligence, a kind that combined wide and somewhat eccentric reading with a precise sense of comic timing and a deep skepticism of easy answers and comfortable resolutions. George Meyer is probably the single writer most closely associated with the show's specific comedic voice during its golden age, though his name is largely unknown to general audiences and his preference for avoiding the spotlight has kept it that way. He was born in 1956 and grew up in a military family that moved frequently, which gives a person a particular kind of perspective on American culture, an outsider's intimacy, an ability to see the country from multiple angles because you have never been rooted in any single part of it long enough to take it for granted. He had worked on Late Night with David Letterman before coming to The Simpsons, and the sensibility he brought from that experience, the Letterman show's combination of genuine affection for popular culture and deep ironic distance from it, its willingness to deconstruct the conventions of television even while using those conventions, fit perfectly with what The Simpsons was attempting. Meyer pushed the show toward a quality he valued above all others in comedy. The joke that was not quite where you expected it to be, the joke that arrived at a slight angle to the setup and revealed something unexpected about the premise, rather than simply confirming what the setup had already implied. He was known within the room for the quality of his individual jokes, for his ability to take a setup and find the version of it that was not only funny but was also true, that illuminated something about the characters or the situation or the world that the more obvious version would have left covered. The writers who worked with him have described his contributions as somewhat uncanny, as though he was accessing a level of the joke that the rest of the room had not quite found yet, and that once he found it, the solution seemed obvious in the way that good comedy always seems obvious in retrospect. Meyer was also one of the founding editors of a satirical newspaper called Army Man, which ran for 3 issues in the late 1980s and which has become, in the years since, something of a legendary artifact of American comedy writing. Army Man published short pieces, many of them very brief, that had a quality that was specific to a particular corner of comedy sensibility, absurdist and precise, and committed to finding the joke that was least expected while also being most true. The publication attracted contributions from many people who would later become significant figures in American comedy, and it serves as a document of a specific moment and a specific community, the late 1980s, Los Angeles comedy underground from which The Simpsons emerged. John Swartzwelder is perhaps the most mythologized figure in the show's writing history, partly because of the volume and quality of his work, and partly because of the circumstances under which he produced it. He wrote or co-wrote over 50 episodes across more than a decade, which makes him, by a significant margin, the most prolific writer in the show's history. He is also, by the accounts of everyone who worked with him, one of the most private people in the entertainment industry. He does not give interviews. He has not been photographed in decades. He worked on The Simpsons from a remote location, sending in scripts rather than appearing in the writer's room, an arrangement that was unique to him and that the show accommodated because his scripts were consistently of the quality that justified any accommodation required. His episodes have a particular quality that regular viewers of the show learn to recognize across repeated viewings. They have a tendency toward a specific kind of logical absurdism, premises that begin in plausible reality and are then extended through impeccable internal logic into regions of complete implausibility, with each step following from the previous step with the kind of strict causation that makes the absurdity feel, paradoxically, entirely earned. The kind of comedy where you follow the logic all the way from the beginning to the end, and when you arrive at the end, which is utterly insane, you cannot find the step where the reasoning went wrong, because the reasoning is, by its own terms, entirely sound. He also wrote some of the show's funniest and most affecting individual scenes, moments that were brief and throwaway by design, but that were built from such precise observation that they stopped you. A background detail in a Swartzwelder episode would frequently contain more specific comedic intelligence than the foreground of a lesser episode. He had a gift for the incidental, for the thing that was not quite the subject of the scene but that was so perfectly observed that it became the thing you remembered. In more recent years, Swartzwelder has published a series of novels featuring a private detective named Frank Burley, which have found a devoted audience among people who follow his work, and which have provided the first sustained public record of his comedic voice outside the context of The Simpsons. The novels have the same quality as his Simpsons episodes, the same logical absurdism, and the same precise comic observation, and the same willingness to follow a premise wherever it leads without worrying about whether the destination seems reasonable. Conan O'Brien joined the show in its third season and wrote for it through the fourth, before leaving to host Late Night. His time on the show produced some of its most celebrated episodes, including Marge vs. The Monorail, which he has frequently cited as the thing he is most proud of having written, a claim that is remarkable given the subsequent decades of his career. His particular contribution to the show was a quality of exuberance, a sense of unbridled comedy energy that was willing to go further and faster and stranger than the room's baseline tendencies suggested. He has spoken in interviews about the show as the most creatively intense experience of his professional life, about the specific quality of being in that room during those years, surrounded by that concentration of talent, working on something that everyone involved felt was genuinely important. Greg Daniels, who would later create the American version of The Office and co-create Parks and Recreation, wrote several of the show's most beloved episodes during this period. His writing had a quality of emotional precision alongside the comedy that became more visible in retrospect, once his later work demonstrated how specifically he had always been interested in the inner lives of characters rather than simply the mechanics of comic situations. John Vitti wrote some of the most emotionally affecting episodes across the early seasons. Jeff Martin contributed a quality of literary reference that enriched the show's texture considerably. Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who were the showrunners for seasons 3 and 4 and then departed to create their own series, had helped establish the formal standards of the show, the specific way a Simpsons episode was structured and paced and resolved, the rhythm of act breaks and the ratio of comedy to emotional content, and the specific way the show earned its endings. What the room had, collectively, was a shared commitment to a particular standard of quality that was demanding and specific. The standard was not about being challenging for its own sake, not about difficulty or obscurity, but about honesty. The joke had to be the truest version of itself. The emotional beat had to be actually felt, not merely gestured at. The satirical point had to emerge from the story rather than being imposed upon it. The characters had to behave the way those characters would actually behave, given who they were and what they had been established to be, rather than the way the story needed them to behave to reach its predetermined destination. This last standard was particularly important and particularly difficult to maintain. The pressure to make characters do what the plot needs them to do is one of the most constant and corrosive forces in television writing. Characters are always in danger of being sacrificed to plot convenience, of saying or doing things that the story requires, but that those characters, as they have been established, would not actually say or do. The Golden Age Simpsons writers fought this constantly, and their success in fighting it is part of what makes those years of episodes feel so specifically alive. You are watching the story discover what happens when these specific people encounter these specific circumstances, rather than watching plot mechanics dressed in character clothing. The process of working in the room was itself a creative act. Stories were broken, meaning plotted out beat by beat, in extended group sessions that could take many hours and that involved everyone present contributing, contesting, adjusting, and refining. The competitive quality of the room, everyone trying to find the better joke, the better turn, the more honest emotional beat, was a significant part of what produced the quality of the final product. The ideas were tested against the most demanding possible audience before they left the room, and the ones that survived were the ones that could withstand that testing. The show went through multiple showrunners as the years progressed, each with their own sensibilities and their own relationships with the show's original vision. Al Jean eventually returned to the show as showrunner and has held the position for an extended period that makes him the figure most associated with the show's later years. The challenge of sustaining a show across decades while maintaining creative quality is one that few long-running series have solved in a fully satisfying way, and The Simpsons is not an exception to this general difficulty. But the foundation that the Golden Age writers' room built was durable enough to support the show through changes and transitions that would have collapsed a less fundamentally solid structure. Expansion, Sam Simon, and the architecture of the show. To understand The Simpsons fully, you need to understand Sam Simon, and understanding Sam Simon requires sitting with a certain amount of discomfort because the story of his relationship with the show is complicated in ways that the show's public history has not always fully acknowledged. Simon came to The Simpsons from a background in network television that was both extensive and somewhat disillusioning. He had worked on Cheers, one of the most critically and commercially successful sitcoms of the 1980s, and he had worked on Taxi, and he had other credits that testified to his genuine abilities as a television writer and producer. But he had also had experiences with the industry that had left him with a clear-eyed and somewhat jaded understanding of how television production worked, of the ways in which creative work got compromised and diluted and distorted by the institutional machinery of network production. When he came to The Simpsons as showrunner, Simon brought this understanding with him, and he used it to build a production structure that was specifically designed to protect the show's creative integrity from the institutional forces that would have preferred it to be safer and more conventional. He built the writer's room to a specific vision. He established production standards that prioritized quality over speed in ways that created friction with the network's scheduling demands but produced better work. He created the processes through which stories were developed and scripts were written and episodes were produced, processes that were specifically designed to ensure that the work that appeared on screen was the work the creative team had actually intended rather than a compromise version shaped by external pressures. Simon's specific contribution was organizational as much as creative. He was not, or not primarily, the source of the show's distinctive comedic voice in the way that George Meyer was. He was the person who built the container that held that voice, who created the conditions under which the writers could do the work they were capable of, who protected the room from the entropy and the institutional pressure that would otherwise have degraded what they were producing. His relationship with Groening was, as noted earlier, genuinely difficult. The two men had different ideas about what the show was and what it should do, and these differences produced real friction that was sometimes expressed in ways that were personally unpleasant for everyone involved. But the friction was also productive, in the specific way that the tension between two intelligent people with genuine disagreements about important things can be productive when both parties are committed to the quality of the work, rather than merely to prevailing in the argument. Simon left the show after the third season, and his departure was not amicable. The settlement he reached with Groening and Brooks and Fox, and the terms of his continued credit and participation in the show's profits, have been a source of legal and public dispute over the years. What is not disputed is that Simon made significant creative contributions to the show during the 3 seasons he was directly involved, contributions that shaped the show's identity in ways that persisted long after he left. In the years after leaving The Simpsons, Simon used the income the show continued to generate to pursue a wide range of philanthropic interests, including significant work in animal welfare and various social justice causes. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer and spent his final years continuing this work with a focus and a generosity that people who knew him described as remarkable. He died in 2015. The tributes that followed his death included acknowledgments from people throughout the entertainment industry of his talent and his impact, including from many who had found his direct manner difficult, and who nevertheless recognized what he had contributed. The story of Sam Simon is, in some ways, the story of the show itself in miniature, a record of genuine creative achievement produced by people with real disagreements about important things, shaped by processes that were sometimes contentious and sometimes dysfunctional, and producing work that transcended the difficulties of its creation because the people involved were, at their best, genuinely committed to making something excellent. Expansion: the show's relationship with religion, science, and what it means to believe. One of the more unusual things about The Simpsons is its sustained and generally thoughtful engagement with questions of faith and religion, questions that American entertainment has historically either avoided or handled with a clumsiness that reflected the difficulty of addressing them in a format designed primarily for entertainment rather than reflection. The show has a complicated relationship with faith. It respects it and questions it simultaneously. It takes seriously the genuine comfort and meaning that religious belief provides to the characters who hold it, while also being entirely willing to subject the specific institutions and practices of organized religion to the same satirical scrutiny it brings to every other institution. Ned Flanders' faith is the show's most sustained engagement with the question of what it means to believe. Ned believes fully and without qualification. His faith is not a performance. It is not a social affiliation. It is the genuine organizing principle of his life, the framework through which he understands everything that happens to him, and the source of the patience and the generosity that define his character. The show takes this seriously. It does not present Ned's faith as stupidity or delusion. It presents it as a genuine response to the world, a genuine attempt to find meaning in experience, a genuine commitment to living according to principles that most people would endorse in the abstract. But the show also, in certain episodes, allows Ned's faith to be challenged in ways that are genuinely difficult. The episode in which Ned's wife Maud is killed, struck by a t-shirt cannon that Homer's selfishness caused to redirect toward her, confronts Ned's faith with the question that serious religious belief always eventually has to answer. Why does a loving God allow terrible things to happen to good people? Ned's response to this question, his struggle to maintain his faith in the face of a loss that is both random and devastating, is treated by the show with a seriousness that the comic context does not diminish. Homer's relationship with God is different from Ned's, and the difference is itself a kind of commentary. Homer has had direct conversations with God on multiple occasions across the show's run. God appears to Homer as a character, speaks to him, answers his questions, and engages with him in ways that are both funny and genuinely warm. The specific quality of the show's God is interesting. He is depicted as genuinely caring about Homer, genuinely engaged with his well-being, not omnipotent in the way that might make human agency irrelevant, but present and responsive in ways that have meaning. God talks to Homer and not to Ned. This is one of the show's quieter jokes and also one of its more pointed observations. The devout man who has organized his entire life around his faith does not receive the direct communication that the haphazard man who falls asleep in church receives. This is not a simple statement about the superiority of Homer's approach to faith. It is a more complex observation about the unpredictability of grace, about the way that genuine religious experience does not follow the rules of merit and effort that we would like it to follow, about the gap between devotion and encounter. The show's engagement with science is similarly double-edged. Lisa is a scientist, or rather a proto-scientist, a child with the instincts and the temperament and the deep commitment to evidence-based understanding that scientific culture celebrates. She is the character through whom the show most often addresses questions about knowledge and evidence and the relationship between what we believe and what we can demonstrate. Her opposition to the teaching of creationism in Springfield schools, her commitment to environmentalism, her vegetarianism, her various political and ethical positions that are rooted in scientific understanding of the world, all of these mark her as the show's avatar of rationalist values. And the show consistently shows her being right about the substance of these positions, while also showing the social cost of being the person in the room who insists on evidence when everyone else would prefer to maintain a comfortable belief. This is not a simple endorsement of scientific rationalism. The show is more interesting than that. It acknowledges that Lisa's correctness comes at a personal cost, that the world she is correct about is not a world that rewards correctness in straightforward ways. and that the pure commitment to evidence that makes her right also makes her lonely in ways that simple wrongness would not. Being right in Springfield is its own form of isolation. Expansion: what the show got wrong, and why that matters too. No discussion of The Simpsons is honest if it acknowledges only the show's achievements and does not spend time with its failures, because the failures are instructive, and because the show has been running long enough that its failures are as revealing as its successes. The most significant ongoing failure of The Simpsons, in the judgment of many critics and longtime viewers, is not any specific episode or specific creative decision, but the broader failure to know when to end. The show has continued producing episodes long past the point where the concentrated quality of its golden age was achievable, and the result has been a body of late-season work that, while not without its moments, represents a significant diminishment from what the show was capable of at its peak. This is not an unusual fate for long-running creative works. Most works that continue beyond their natural conclusion produce diminishing returns, and the specific pressures that keep television shows going, the commercial pressures, the institutional pressures, the genuine difficulty of ending something that is still generating revenue and still finding an audience, mean that most shows continue longer than their creative life strictly requires. The Simpsons made this choice, or had it made for it by the circumstances of its commercial success, and the result is a show that exists now in a peculiar temporal split, simultaneously the greatest animated series in television history and a show that has been coasting on that reputation for a significant portion of its run. These two things are both true, and the way they coexist is itself an interesting aspect of the show's story. The portrayal of Apu Nahasa Mapetalon, as discussed in the section on the voice cast, represents a different kind of failure, a failure of representation and empathy that the show has acknowledged and responded to, though the response has been imperfect and has itself generated discussion about the best way to address the problem. The character was created in a different cultural moment, with different expectations about what was appropriate and what was harmful, and the gap between those expectations and current understanding is real. The show has also been criticized for various other representation issues across its run, for the ways it has depicted particular communities and groups, for the specific jokes it has made at the expense of particular kinds of people. Some of these criticisms are well-founded. Some reflect the specific expectations of their particular cultural moment rather than timeless standards. The show has been willing to engage with some of these criticisms and less willing to engage with others, and the pattern of engagement and avoidance is itself revealing. None of this diminishes what the show achieved at its best. It contextualizes it, which is a different thing. Great works are not immune to criticism and are not diminished by it. They are made more interesting by it, more complex, more fully part of the ongoing conversation about what kind of stories we tell and who we tell them about, and what it means to do these things responsibly and with genuine care. The Simpsons has earned the serious engagement with its failures that its serious engagement with its successes demands. It is a large enough and important enough work that it deserves to be treated as such, which means being held to the standards it established in its best years, while also being understood in the context of the limitations and failures that have coexisted with those achievements across the decades. Section 11: Music, Animation, and the Craft of Making Springfield. Every creative work is, in part, the sum of its technical decisions, the choices made by the craftspeople who execute a vision rather than generate it, who translate the ideas of writers and directors into the specific sensory experience of the finished work. In the case of The Simpsons, two technical elements above all others define the experience of watching: the music and the animation. Both have histories that are interesting on their own terms, and both contributed to the show's identity in ways that go beyond mere execution. The music of The Simpsons begins with Danny Elfman's theme, which is one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of music in the history of American popular culture. Elfman composed it in 1989, shortly before the show's premiere, and he did it in a remarkably short time, which might suggest a minor piece of work, but which actually reflects the particular gift of a composer who can find the essence of something quickly when the brief is clear and the instinct is right. Elfman came to the project from a background that was already unusual. He had been the lead singer of the new wave band Oingo Boingo and had transitioned into film composition through his work with Tim Burton, producing the scores for Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice and Batman. His compositional style at this point in his career was characterized by a kind of orchestral exuberance, a willingness to use large ensembles in ways that were theatrical and rhythmically propulsive, and not afraid of the slightly artificial quality that comes from bringing a full symphony orchestra to bear on material that had its roots in pop and rock and the deliberately weird. The Simpsons theme brought this sensibility to bear on the specific challenge of establishing a television family's world in 45 seconds. It needed to do several things simultaneously. Establish that the show was set in a specific kind of American domestic world. Communicate a quality of energy and chaos that was appropriate for a family of 5, including 3 children. Signal that the show's tone was comic and somewhat irreverent rather than dramatic. And be immediately memorable enough that audiences would associate it instantly with the show after only a few hearings. The theme achieves all of this, and it does so with a combination of sophisticated orchestration and genuine catchiness that is harder to produce than it might seem. The specific quality of the theme, its sense of busy, slightly manic forward motion, its unexpected harmonic turns, its building energy toward the final chord, all of these are precise creative decisions that could have been made differently and that were made exactly right. The theme is not merely functional. It is genuinely good music, music that rewards listening on its own terms. Danny Elfman has spoken in various interviews about the speed with which the theme arrived for him, suggesting that the specific combination of brief and context and his own existing sensibilities produced something that felt complete almost immediately. Whether or not this precise account is accurate, the theme has the quality of something that arrived whole rather than being assembled piece by piece. It sounds inevitable in the way that the best pieces of music do, as though it could not have been any other way. The music that underscores individual scenes during episodes is the work of Alf Clausen, who served as the show's composer and music director from the 2nd season through the 28th, a tenure of nearly 30 years, during which he composed and arranged an extraordinary volume of music tailored to the specific needs of individual episodes. Clausen came to The Simpsons from a background in film and television composition, with a particular facility for pastiche and genre work that proved essential to the show's musical identity. The Simpsons, across its run, has required music in virtually every conceivable style and genre. It has needed the sound of big band jazz and country and western and opera and choral music and film noir scores, and action movie themes and children's educational programming and dozens of other musical modes, each required to serve a specific comedic or emotional purpose within an episode. Clausen was able to produce all of these with a facility and a precision that made them work not just as background texture, but as active, comedic, and emotional elements of the scenes they accompanied. The ability to produce convincing pastiche is not the same as the ability to produce original music, but it is a distinct and genuinely difficult skill, and Clausen had it in abundance. When the show needed a musical cue that sounded like the score from a 1950s science fiction film, or like the kind of swelling romantic orchestration that accompanies a melodramatic revelation in a soap opera, or like a show tune from the height of the Broadway Golden Age, Clausen could produce those sounds with a precision that communicated, in the space of a few bars, exactly what the scene required. The music was doing comedy as much as the dialogue was, and the comedy it was doing required a specific technical knowledge combined with a specific comic sensibility, an understanding of not just how these musical genres sounded, but how the audience's familiarity with them could be deployed for effect. The show has also, across its history, featured an extraordinary number of original songs. Some of the most celebrated and beloved moments in the show's run involve original musical numbers, songs written specifically for individual episodes that are performed with a commitment and a craft that elevates them above the usual standard of television variety programming. A Streetcar Named Marge, the Season 4 episode in which Marge appears in a local production of a musical adaptation of the Tennessee Williams play, contains a full-scale musical number that works both as a parody of a specific theatrical tradition and as a genuine character piece for Marge, simultaneously funny and revealing. The animation itself evolved significantly across the show's run, though the changes were sometimes too gradual to notice from episode to episode and became apparent only when early seasons were watched alongside later ones. The early seasons, animated by Klasky Supo, had a quality that was rough and slightly crude and genuinely distinctive, a visual sensibility that reflected the characters' emotional rawness, their tendency to physical extremity and exaggeration. The characters in the early episodes moved with an urgency and an ungainliness that felt right for who they were. When the animation moved to film Roman after the first season, and as the production processes became more sophisticated and the budgets more substantial, the animation became more fluid and more polished. This was largely an improvement in technical terms. The characters moved with greater precision, the backgrounds were more detailed, the timing of visual gags was more controlled, but the increased polish also gradually changed the visual character of the show, smoothing out some of the rough texture that had made the early seasons feel so specifically alive. The roughness was not a flaw in the early work. It was part of its identity, part of what communicated the family's specific quality of barely contained chaos, and some of that quality was lost in the transition to greater technical sophistication. David Silverman was the key figure in the show's visual development, serving as a director and animation supervisor whose influence on the show's visual identity was profound and sustained. He was responsible for many of the show's most visually ambitious sequences, for establishing the way that the show used camera movement and visual pacing and the specific grammar of cartoon sight gags to serve the stories and the characters. He understood that animation is not simply illustrated dialogue but a visual medium with its own specific possibilities, and he pushed the show to exploit those possibilities, rather than simply using the animation as a delivery mechanism for the voice performances. The visual world of Springfield itself developed in ways that were only partly planned and partly accumulated through necessity and inspiration across hundreds of episodes. The town grew as it was needed, with new locations appearing when stories required them, and existing locations being refined and detailed across many episodes until they had the quality of real places, places you felt you knew well enough to find your way around. The visual gags embedded in Springfield's backgrounds, the signs and storefronts and background details that rewarded close attention and multiple viewings, became one of the show's signature pleasures, a layer of content that existed alongside the main action for viewers who were looking for it. The Simpsons' relationship to visual culture more broadly was always knowing and referential, drawing on the traditions of American animation and film and television with an awareness that its audience would recognize the references and appreciate the conversation they created. Specific episodes were constructed as extended homages to specific films or directors or genres, visual essays that worked both as entertainment in their own right and as commentary on the traditions they were engaging with. This reflexivity, this awareness of its own relationship to the culture it was part of and was commenting on, was a significant part of what gave the show its particular quality of intelligence. The specific yellow of the character's skin, a choice that was made early and has remained entirely consistent across the show's entire run, is worth noting as an example of how a technical decision can become an aesthetic identity. The yellow was chosen for practical reasons, as discussed earlier, but it has become one of the most distinctive visual signatures in popular culture. When you see that specific shade of yellow applied to a cartoon face with those specific proportions, you know immediately what you are looking at. The yellow is the show. The show is the yellow. It is an example of a decision that was made for mundane reasons and became, through consistent application across decades, something that could not have been imagined differently. Expansion, The Springfield Files, and what the show believed about itself. One of the most interesting things about The Simpsons across its long run is the way it periodically addressed its own nature, its own status as a television show, its own relationship to the American culture. It was both reflecting and shaping. The show was reflexive in ways that were sophisticated without being merely clever, that used self-awareness as a tool for saying something rather than simply as a demonstration of intelligence. The Season 8 episode, The Springfield Files, is one of the show's purest expressions of this quality. It is structured as an X-Files parody, complete with David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson reprising their roles as Mulder and Scully in a guest appearance, that the show uses both for the genuine comedy of the crossover and for something more interesting. A meditation on what it means to be the kind of person who believes in things that cannot be proven. Homer, walking home from Moe's Tavern in a state of considerable intoxication, sees what appears to be an alien in the woods. The alien is glowing and communicating a sense of peace and love and something otherworldly. Homer reports this to the authorities. The town's response, and the FBI's response, and the media's response follow the expected pattern: dismissal, ridicule, a grudging investigation that finds nothing, followed by everyone gathering in the woods on a Friday night to watch whether the alien returns. And it does return, and when it is revealed, the alien is not an alien at all. It is Mr. Burns, who has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so extreme that it causes his body to glow, and who wanders through the woods in a dazed state after each session. The thing Homer saw was his employer. The peace and love Homer perceived was the specific quality of intense physical exhaustion that resembles beatitude from the outside. The episode is funny. It is also, if you follow it carefully, a meditation on the relationship between belief and evidence, on the human need to find the extraordinary in the ordinary, on the way that the desire for something more meaningful than the daily grind can lead people to see things that are not there. Homer wanted to see an alien. He needed the world to contain something more remarkable than Mr. Burns. And when the extraordinary thing was revealed to be the most ordinary possible explanation, the show did not present this as a simple victory of reason over superstition. It presented it as a melancholy deflation of a hope that was genuine, even if the evidence for it was not. This quality, the willingness to honor the feeling even when deflating the belief, is characteristic of the show at its best. The Simpsons is not a cynical show. It is an honest show. And honesty sometimes means acknowledging that the thing people want to believe is not true, while also acknowledging that the wanting is real and understandable and not without its own kind of value. The show's use of guest stars across its run is itself worth examining, because it reflects something interesting about how the show understood its own cultural position. The Simpsons had, by its third or fourth season, reached a level of cultural prominence that made appearing in the show desirable to a very wide range of celebrities, musicians, athletes, politicians, and public figures. The list of guest appearances across the show's history is genuinely remarkable, covering virtually every significant figure in American popular culture across 3.5 decades. The show used these guest appearances in a way that was specific and somewhat unusual. Rather than simply using celebrities to attract audiences, which is the conventional television approach, The Simpsons frequently used celebrity appearances to say something about the celebrities themselves, or about what they represented, or about the culture's relationship to the kind of fame they embodied. The guest stars were given material that was genuinely funny and that often engaged with their public personas in ways that were simultaneously flattering and deflating. Elizabeth Taylor appeared in the show's first significant celebrity guest appearance, voicing Maggie's first word, which was simply "Daddy." This choice, giving Maggie's first utterance to one of the most famous actresses in the history of American cinema, was both a joke about the disproportion between the occasion and the talent, and a genuine piece of emotional storytelling, because the word "daddy" addressed to Homer, coming from a source that gave the moment a quality of unexpected grandeur, landed as a genuine expression of the bond between the baby and her father. Michael Jackson appeared in an episode in which Homer is committed to a mental institution and shares a room with a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson. The episode was written as a tribute to Jackson's work, using the music and the persona to say something genuine about loneliness and fame, and the gap between the person that celebrity projects and the person who lives inside it. It remains one of the show's most celebrated episodes, both for the quality of the writing and for the strange historical quality of the collaboration. Johnny Cash voiced a coyote in a drug trip sequence that was one of the show's most formally experimental segments, a brief psychedelic passage in which Homer's spirit guide, voiced by Cash's distinctive baritone, guided him through a hallucinatory landscape toward a self-understanding that was both comic and, in the way the show managed these things, genuinely felt. The relationship between the show and the celebrities who appeared in it was, at its best, a genuine creative collaboration rather than a commercial transaction. The show brought to the appearances the same quality of care and specificity that it brought to its regular characters, and the celebrities brought to the work, in many cases, a willingness to engage with their public personas in ways that required a genuine sense of humor about who they were and how they were perceived. The Treehouse of Horror episodes. The annual Halloween specials that ran outside the show's normal continuity and allowed the characters to inhabit horror and science fiction scenarios that the regular episodes could not accommodate, developed across the show's run into a tradition that was beloved by viewers, and that gave the writing staff a specific creative freedom they used with considerable ingenuity. The Halloween specials were not bound by the same rules as regular episodes. Characters could die. The narrative logic could be pushed further into the genuinely surreal. The show could engage with horror and science fiction conventions in ways that involved genuine darkness rather than merely the shadows of darkness. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes drew on classic horror stories, including adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King, and other canonical sources of American Gothic fear. The adaptations were funny, but they were also genuinely atmospheric, capable of producing genuine unease alongside the comedy. The show understood, from these early experiments, that comedy and horror were not opposites but relatives, that they both worked by subverting expectations, and that the skills required to do one well were closely related to the skills required to do the other. As the Treehouse of Horror tradition developed across many seasons, it accumulated its own internal mythology, its own recurring characters and scenarios and formats, its own relationship to the rest of the show that gave it a quality of ritual as much as entertainment. By the time a viewer had seen 10 or 15 or 20 Treehouse of Horror episodes, the annual special had become an event with specific expectations attached to it, expectations about structure and tone, and the specific combination of horror, parody, and Simpsons character comedy that the specials had established. This accumulation of tradition, this building of expectation across many years of consistent production, is one of the things that television can do that other narrative forms cannot easily replicate. A film can be great, but it ends. A book can be profound, but it concludes. A television show that runs long enough becomes something more than a sequence of episodes. It becomes a sustained relationship between an audience and a set of characters and a creative team. A relationship that has its own history and its own rituals and its own way of marking the passage of time. The Simpsons is one of the few shows that has run long enough and consistently enough to develop this quality fully, to become not just a television show but a television institution. A thing that exists in the culture the way that certain physical places exist, as a landmark that people orient themselves by even when they are not directly attending to it. Expansion Springfield's geography and the meaning of nowhere. Springfield, the town where the Simpson family lives, does not exist in any specific American state. This is both deliberate and philosophically significant. Groening chose the name Springfield partly because it is one of the most common city names in America, appearing in states across the entire country, which meant that calling the show's setting Springfield was a way of making it universally familiar without making it specifically located. But the show has done more than simply avoid specifying a state. It has actively constructed a Springfield that is geographically impossible, a place that contains within its borders the kind of geographical diversity that only an entire country could contain. Springfield has mountains and it has coastline. It has desert and it has farmland. It has a harbor and also, depending on the episode, a landlocked position that would make a harbor impossible. It borders Ohio in one episode and Kentucky in another, and appears to be in the Pacific Northwest in a third. It has weather that ranges from Arctic blizzard conditions to tropical heat with no apparent regional climate to anchor either extreme. This geographic impossibility is, on one level, simply the result of the floating continuity that long-running animated shows develop when they are not careful about maintaining internal consistency across many years of production. Writers forget details from earlier episodes. The town's geography in a given episode is whatever the story requires it to be, regardless of what previous episodes have established. But it is also, on another level, something more interesting than that. Springfield's geographic impossibility reflects something true about how people experience the places they live. The specific geography of a town is rarely what you actually know about it. What you know is the network of relationships and routines and places that constitute your daily life within it, and these things are not geographical. They are social and emotional and habitual, organized not around longitude and latitude, but around where you go and who you see and what you do and what you feel about all of it. Springfield is organized this way, around the emotional geography of the Simpson family's daily life. and its physical geography is relatively irrelevant to that organization. This is why the show can contradict itself about Springfield's location repeatedly without the viewer noticing or caring much. You do not need to know where Springfield is in relation to the actual map of America to know your way around it. You know where Moe's Tavern is in relation to the power plant. You know where the Simpson house sits in relation to the Flanders house. You know that the elementary school is in the center of town and that the country club is at the edges. This knowledge is not geographical in the conventional sense. It is relational, organized around the characters and their movements, and it is entirely sufficient for understanding everything that happens in Springfield. The show's various attempts to address its own geographic mystery are themselves interesting. In a 2012 interview, Matt Groening told Smithsonian Magazine that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, the city near where he grew up. This statement was treated by fans as a definitive answer to the long-running question, and then quietly undermined by subsequent episodes that placed Springfield in geographic contexts that were inconsistent with Oregon. The answer was given and then taken back, not through any explicit retraction, but simply through the show's continued practice of treating Springfield's location as undetermined. This is the show behaving with the specific kind of intelligence that has always characterized its best work. It could have committed to an answer. It chose instead to acknowledge the question while preserving the openness that had always made the question interesting. Springfield's location is everywhere and nowhere, because that is where it needs to be, because a town that belongs to everyone is a town without a fixed address, and because the decision to make Springfield universally familiar was a decision about the kind of show The Simpsons was going to be, a show that spoke to the American experience broadly rather than to any particular region of it. Expansion Homer's many jobs and what they say about American work. Over the course of the show's run, Homer Simpson has held an extraordinary number of jobs. This is partly a function of episodic storytelling, the need to generate new situations by placing the characters in new circumstances, and partly something more interesting, a sustained exploration of American working life that the show has conducted through the simple method of putting Homer in every corner of it. Homer has been a safety inspector, which is his default employment, the job that defines his daily life and his relationship with Mr. Burns and the nuclear plant's particular brand of institutional dysfunction. He has been a country musician. He has been a food critic. He has been a boxing promoter. He has been a missionary in a Pacific Island community. He has been an astronaut. He has been a police officer. He has been a professional bowler. He has been a mayor. He has driven a truck. He has opened a restaurant. He has been a grease collector. He has managed a rock band. The episode in which Homer manages a rock band, featuring the fictional band Spinal Tap in the form of a group called Hullabalooza, is also the episode that most explicitly addresses the generation gap, the specific kind of confusion that arises when a man who came of age in one cultural moment tries to participate in a cultural moment that belongs to a generation younger than him. Homer at a music festival in the 1990s is a man out of his time trying to pretend he is not, trying to find the version of himself that can still be cool, and failing in ways that the episode treats with both comedy and a specific kind of sympathy. But the larger pattern of Homer's many jobs is worth considering as a portrait of American working life. Homer approaches every job with the same quality of initial enthusiasm, followed by the same failure to sustain the discipline required to be good at it. He is capable of genuine moments of success, moments when his specific combination of luck and blundering persistence and occasional unexpected insight produces results that his incompetence would not predict. These moments are not accidents of the plot. They reflect something the show believes about Homer, which is that he contains more than he usually delivers, that the gap between his potential and his performance is a function of something external as much as something internal. The show has addressed this most directly in the episode where a crayon is discovered lodged in Homer's brain since childhood, a crayon that has been literally reducing his cognitive function across his entire adult life. When the crayon is removed, Homer's IQ rises dramatically. He becomes articulate and insightful, and capable of engaging with the world in ways that his usual cognitive state prevents. And then, unable to bear the loneliness of being the most intelligent person in his immediate environment, unable to sustain the social cost of seeing clearly a world that was designed for people who do not see clearly, he has the crayon reinserted. This is one of the show's most bleak and most honest moments. It says, with characteristic directness, that intelligence is not simply a benefit, that seeing clearly carries costs, that intelligence alone cannot pay, and that the choice to remain comfortable in an environment that cannot sustain your full capacities is a choice that real people make for reasons that are understandable, even if they are also sad. Homer's many jobs also trace a particular American anxiety about the nature of work itself, about the difference between what work is supposed to mean and what it actually is. Work is supposed to be meaningful. Work is supposed to provide not just income but identity, not just money but purpose, not just a salary but a role in the world that connects you to something larger than yourself. Homer's job at the nuclear plant provides none of these things. It is a job he took and kept not because it matched any aspiration, but because circumstances required employment, and this was what was available, and he has remained in it through a combination of inertia and Mr. Burns's specific reasons for keeping him there. This is the reality of working life for many Americans, a reality that the show depicts without sentimentality and without contempt, simply as the condition that many people inhabit, the gap between what work was supposed to be and what it actually is in most people's daily lives. And Homer's periodic escapes into other jobs, his brief careers as a country musician or a food critic or an astronaut, are the show's way of exploring what Homer might have been capable of if circumstances had arranged themselves differently, if the crayon had never been in his brain, if his mother had not been driven away, if the world had been organized in a way that made better use of what Homer actually had to offer. The jobs are funny. They are also, if you are paying attention, an ongoing elegy for unrealized potential, a sustained meditation on the distance between the person you are and the person you might have been, which is one of the more quietly devastating things the show manages to sustain across its entire run. Section 12. How the Simpsons Changed America and Changed Television. A television show changes culture in ways that are very difficult to measure precisely, because culture changes continuously and the specific contribution of any single work to that change is always entangled with everything else that was happening simultaneously. But some contributions are clear enough that the attempt at understanding them is worth making, and The Simpsons' contribution to American culture is among the clearest of any single piece of entertainment in the last century. The most fundamental thing The Simpsons changed was the perceived possibility of primetime animated television for adults. Before The Simpsons, the conventional wisdom of the television industry was that animated series were children's programming, that the audience for animation was, by definition, a younger audience, and that primetime animation aimed at adults would fail to find a sufficient audience to justify its production costs. This belief was not entirely without foundation. Several attempts at primetime adult animation in the previous decades had confirmed it. The genre was considered commercially and creatively exhausted. The Simpsons disproved this conventional wisdom so comprehensively and so immediately that it changed the conditions under which subsequent animated series were developed. The success of The Simpsons created a market for primetime adult animation that had not previously existed in any sustainable form, and into that market came a succession of shows that would not have been made without The Simpsons' proof of concept. Beavis and Butthead arrived in 1993 on MTV, targeting a specific demographic within the broader adult animation audience, with a deliberately provocative aesthetic that was the distant opposite of The Simpsons' warmth and craft, but that shared its willingness to use animation as a vehicle for adult sensibility and adult humor. South Park arrived in 1997, pushing the boundaries of animated content in directions that were more aggressive and more explicitly transgressive than The Simpsons had been willing to go, but operating within an expanded space of possibility that The Simpsons had helped create. Family Guy arrived in 1999, explicitly in the tradition that The Simpsons had established, with a dysfunctional family at its center and a willingness to use the cartoon format for humor that live-action family television would not have been able to accommodate. None of these shows are The Simpsons. Some of them are very good. Some of them have produced comedy that deserves celebration on its own terms. But all of them exist in a landscape that The Simpsons created, and their creators have generally been explicit about this debt. The animated television landscape of the late 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s would not have existed in anything like its current form, without The Simpsons opening the door in 1989. Beyond its influence on animation, The Simpsons had a deeper and more diffuse influence on the texture of American comedy itself. The show helped popularize, and in some respects invent, a style of comedy that has come to dominate American humor in ways that are so pervasive they have become the water rather than anything you notice swimming through. The style involves a particular relationship between sincerity and irony, in which genuine feeling and its comedic deflation are held in equilibrium, in which the joke is aware of itself as a joke but does not lose any of its emotional content through that awareness. This is a difficult thing to describe precisely, but anyone who has spent time with the show knows the quality it refers to. The Simpsons could make you genuinely cry in the middle of an episode that had been making you laugh, and the transition between these states was not jarring because the show had established from the beginning that comedy and feeling were not opposed but deeply intertwined, that the laughter and the sadness came from the same place, from the same honest attention to what it was like to be a person trying to be good in a world that did not always make that easy. This quality, this emotional honesty expressed through comedy, influenced a generation of comedy writers who grew up watching the show and who carried its sensibilities into their own work. The specific register of contemporary American comedy, the knowing and self-aware and emotionally accessible quality that characterizes so much of what is considered excellent in comedy writing now, has its roots in multiple places and multiple traditions, but The Simpsons is among the most significant of them. The show also changed television's relationship to its own past and to popular culture generally. The Simpsons was one of the first television series to be consistently and deliberately intertextual, to engage with the history of film and television, and literature and music, not as an occasional reference, but as a sustained practice, as a fundamental mode of engaging with its subject matter. Episodes were built around extended dialogues with specific films or directors or genres, visual and narrative homages that worked simultaneously as entertainment and as a kind of criticism. This practice taught television that its audience was sophisticated enough to appreciate these dialogues, that viewers who had grown up watching television and movies and reading books were capable of engaging with work that assumed their familiarity with the culture it was in conversation with, and that this engagement added a dimension of pleasure that did not require any prior knowledge to appreciate, but that rewarded it enormously when it was there. The show's satirical targets ranged across the entire landscape of American society. Corporate power, in the form of Mr. Burns and the nuclear power plant, which served as the show's central metaphor for the way that concentrated economic power shapes ordinary life in ways that ordinary people cannot easily see or resist. Political dysfunction, in the form of Springfield's various civic disasters. Religion, in the form of the show's complex and affectionate and somewhat skeptical engagement with Ned Flanders' faith. The educational system, the media, the healthcare system, celebrity culture, the military, the justice system, the show was not randomly provocative. It was systematically observant, turning its specific combination of affection and skepticism on every institution it encountered. The satirical approach the show used was distinctive. It did not take the position that American institutions were simply corrupt or simply failing, a position that is emotionally easy and comedically limited. It took the more complex and more honest position that these institutions were simultaneously worth caring about and consistently failing to live up to what they claim to be, which is a position that requires both affection and criticism to sustain simultaneously, and which the show sustained with remarkable consistency across its golden age. The satire was always in the service of something larger, always connected to the human story at the episode's center, rather than existing purely for its own intellectual pleasure. Springfield itself became a kind of American imaginative geography, a place that felt simultaneously specific and universal, that seemed familiar to viewers regardless of where they actually lived. This was a deliberate design choice, as Groening has confirmed, the choice to make Springfield unlocatable so that it could be everywhere, to make it the town everyone grew up in rather than a specific place that some people would recognize and others would not. But it also worked in ways that went beyond the deliberate design choice, because the town accumulated enough specific detail across hundreds of episodes to feel genuinely real, to feel like a place you had been to rather than a set designed to suggest a place. The show held up a mirror to American life for 3.5 decades. Not a flattering mirror, not a distorting mirror, A clear mirror, held at a slight angle, so that what you saw was recognizable as yourself but also slightly strange, as all mirrors slightly estrange us from the image they return. And over time, the country changed in ways that brought it closer to what the mirror showed. Springfield's specific brand of corporate capture and civic dysfunction and distracted inattentiveness became more recognizable, not less, as the decades passed. The show itself has addressed this in various ways. The characters' awareness that they exist in a television show, their occasional direct addresses to the audience, their references to the show's own history and conventions, all of this created a quality of reflexivity that made the show more than a simple mirror. It was a mirror that knew it was a mirror, that was aware of the act of reflection, and that used that awareness to produce a more complex image than simple reflection would have allowed. Section 13. The Legacy, 36 seasons, almost 800 episodes, and what it all means. The Simpsons has been on the air since 1989. It has produced more than 35 seasons and is approaching 800 episodes, numbers that have no precedent in the history of American primetime television. No scripted series has run as long. No animated series has run anywhere close to as long. The show occupies a unique position in the history of the medium, a position that is part comedy achievement, part cultural institution, and part something that does not quite have a name because nothing quite like it has existed before. The longevity is sometimes discussed as though it were primarily a financial matter, a question of how long a franchise can be sustained before it becomes more valuable as a brand than as a creative work. There is an uncomfortable amount of truth in this framing. The Simpsons has been, since its first season, an enormously valuable commercial property, generating revenue from merchandise and licensing and syndication that dwarfs even the substantial income from the show's original production and broadcast. The yellow family on a white background is one of the most recognizable images in the world. It appears on items sold in countries where the show may be less familiar than the characters' faces, because the characters have escaped their context and become icons in the way that very few fictional creations manage to do. But the longevity is also a creative achievement of a different kind than the Golden Age episodes. Sustaining anything for 35 years is difficult. Sustaining the core identity of a creative work, the sense of what it is and what it stands for and what it is trying to do, across that length of time and across the immense number of individual production decisions that 35 years of weekly television requires, is a different kind of achievement than the concentrated quality of the Golden Age. It is a durability achievement rather than a quality achievement, and durability is its own form of merit. The show has not maintained the level of creative achievement of its first 8 seasons. This is not a controversial statement among people who follow it carefully. The show became safer as it aged, became more predictable in its emotional beats and its satirical targets, became more reliant on guest appearances and pop culture references as substitutes for the kind of deep character work that had made the early years so remarkable. The specific quality of surprise that characterized the Golden Age, the sense that you genuinely could not predict where an episode was going to go, that the writers were willing to follow an idea anywhere it led, became less frequent as the show entered its middle and later years. But the show also continued, throughout its long run, to produce episodes that reached the standard of its best years. Not consistently, not reliably, not with the concentrated density of quality that the first 8 seasons had established, but periodically, in episodes that reminded long-term viewers why they had invested so deeply in this family and this world. The show's continued capacity for genuine feeling and genuine comedy, when the conditions were right and the writers found the combination they were looking for, was evidence that the core of the show was still intact, that the foundation laid in the Golden Age was genuinely durable. The show's cultural presence remained significant in ways that went beyond any individual episode's quality. The Simpsons had, by the time it reached its 20th season, become part of the background of American life in a way that only the most enduring cultural works achieve. Its characters were shorthand for specific human types. Its catchphrases had passed into common usage entirely separated from their origin. Its satirical observations about specific institutions and behaviors had become reference points in the culture's ongoing conversation with itself. The predictions phenomenon, the list of apparently accurate forecasts that the show had made about future events, became a significant part of its cultural legacy in the 2010s and 2020s, driven partly by social media's ability to surface and amplify specific moments, and partly by genuine surprise at the number of coincidences the show had accumulated across its long run. A 2000 episode depicting Donald Trump as a former president appeared to forecast his actual presidency 16 years in advance. A 1998 episode depicting Disney acquiring Fox appeared to forecast a merger that would not happen until 2019. A 1993 episode depicting a flu virus spreading from Asia appeared to many viewers to anticipate certain aspects of the 2020 pandemic. The show's writers have been consistent and fairly philosophical in their explanations of this phenomenon. The volume of content the show has produced over 35 years, they note, is so large that statistical coincidences are inevitable. The writers who made these episodes were intelligent, well-read observers of American cultural and political trends, and their extrapolations of existing trends into absurd futures were sometimes accurate simply because the trends they were extrapolating were real and continued. The predictions were not prophecy. They were pattern recognition, executed with enough intelligence and enough specificity that some of them matched future reality in ways that felt surprising. Matt Groening, in his 70s at the time of this narration, has continued to create. He created Futurama, the animated science fiction series that ran on Fox and then Comedy Central and has been revived multiple times, and which shares certain sensibilities with The Simpsons, but occupies a different emotional and satirical space. The show's science fiction setting allowed Groening and his collaborators to address certain kinds of satire about technology and the future of human society and the persistence of human stupidity across all possible futures that the domestic setting of The Simpsons made less accessible. He has remained, by accounts of people who have worked with him across his career, essentially the same person he was when he was drawing Life in Hell in his apartment in Los Angeles in the late 1970s. Curious, funny, skeptical of authority, interested in the gap between what things claim to be and what they actually are, and genuinely in love with the act of making something. The success and the fame and the decades of cultural prominence have not, apparently, changed the fundamental quality of the person, which is itself a kind of achievement. The show's treatment of American family life, which was its original and most fundamental subject, has aged in ways that are interesting to examine from the current vantage point. The family structure the show depicted in 1989, the working-class nuclear family with a mother who did not work outside the home and a father in industrial employment, has become less typical of American family life than it was when the show began. The economic conditions that shape the family's specific anxieties, the assumption that a single working-class income could sustain a house and a family in a middle-class neighborhood, have shifted substantially in the decades since the show premiered. The world The Simpsons live in is, in some respects, a period piece, an artifact of a specific moment in American economic and social history. But the emotional content of the show, the dynamics between the family members, the recurring themes of love and disappointment and aspiration and failure, and the stubborn persistence of hope in the face of consistent evidence against it, have not aged at all. These themes are not period-specific. Homer's complicated love for his family, his genuine desire to do better combined with his genuine inability to sustain the effort, is recognizable to anyone who has ever tried to be better than they are and found the trying harder than expected. Lisa's loneliness and her refusal to compromise what she cares about despite the social cost is recognizable to anyone who has ever been the person in the room who cared too much about something the room found unimportant. Marge's exhausted loyalty, her continued commitment to a marriage and a family that demands more than it gives back in any short-term accounting, is recognizable to anyone who has ever maintained a long-term commitment through difficulty because the commitment itself was the point. These things are why the show worked in 1989 and why it still works now, when viewed in the context of what it was and what it was trying to do. The specific satire dates, the emotional reality does not. The show will end eventually. Every show ends. The Simpsons will end, and when it does, the cultural response will be significant, a recognition that something that has been present for the entire adult lives of most of its current audience has finally concluded. There will be tributes and retrospectives and analyses and arguments about what it meant and what its best work was and how it should be remembered. There will be the specific kind of grief that people feel when something that has been continuously present in their lives for a long time is no longer there. A grief that is partly about the thing itself and partly about the passage of time that the thing's ending marks. But before that happens, while the show continues, there is still this. A family on a couch on Evergreen Terrace, in a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, living the same life they have been living since 1989, facing the same challenges they have always faced, loving each other in the imperfect and sometimes ridiculous and deeply genuine way they have always loved each other. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, unchanged, every Sunday evening in a different year, always there when you turn to them. Closing reflection. The couch, the town, the family. We have come a long way tonight. From a middle child in Portland with a sketchbook, through an underground comic strip about an anxious rabbit, to a waiting room in Hollywood where a man changed his mind and drew a family in the space of less than an hour, through the rough and vital early shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show, through the chaotic production of a first season that did not quite know yet what it was becoming, through the sustained achievement of years of the best television comedy this country has produced, through the voices and the music and the animation and the craft, through the cultural impact and the longevity and the strange institution the show became. And we have arrived here, which is where you are right now, somewhere comfortable at the end of a day, with this voice for company and the specific kind of tiredness that comes when you have been paying attention to something for a while and your attention has softened around the edges into something closer to dreaming. The Simpsons is not, in the end, a show about yellow people in a cartoon town. It is a show about the specific difficulty and the specific joy of being in a family. About loving people you did not choose and who did not choose you, who are imperfect in ways that are sometimes funny and sometimes painful and always genuinely human, who require things of you that you do not always have and who give you things that you did not know you needed. Matt Groening drew a family in a waiting room and gave them his father's name and his mother's hair and a street name from his own childhood and a town without a specific location because he wanted the family to be everyone's family, to be placeable in the emotional geography of anyone who had ever sat at a table with people they loved and found the experience both maddening and essential. He succeeded more completely than anyone in that waiting room could possibly have imagined. There is a moment in a later season of the show, one of those isolated moments that rise above their surroundings and remind you of what the show at its best could achieve, in which Homer explains why he has done something questionable. He says, essentially, that he is not a bad man. He is a man who sometimes does bad things. The distinction is small but genuine and precisely observed, the kind of distinction that the show at its best was always making, the kind of observation about the gap between who we are and how we behave that is so accurate and so simply stated that it lands like a small shock of recognition. That recognition, repeated across 35 years and almost 800 episodes, is the gift the show has given its audience. Not comfort, exactly, though comfort is part of it. Something more specific. The specific comfort of being seen clearly, of having the mess and the effort and the occasional grace of ordinary human life acknowledged and treated as worthy of attention, as the proper and sufficient subject of art, as enough. The show goes on. The family endures. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie slide onto the couch every week and have been doing so for longer than most of their audience has been alive and will continue to do so for as long as there is an audience that wants to see them. There will always be an audience that wants to see them because the family is us. It always was. Sleep well, the couch is there whenever you need it. 11 Labs production notes. This script is optimized for slow, measured delivery with natural breath pauses at paragraph breaks. Recommended pace. Approximately 120 to 130 words per minute. Emotional emphasis on family themes in sections 4, 7, and the closing reflection. Section headings should be read with a slight pause before and after. The subscriber call to action at the end of section 1 should be delivered with warmth and intimacy, slightly slower than the surrounding narration. The closing reflection should slow to approximately 110 words per minute, allowing the emotional content to land fully. Expansion. The show in the world, merchandise, culture, and what The Simpsons became. In the spring of 1990, something happened to The Simpsons that none of its creators had quite anticipated in its full dimensions. The show's merchandising became a cultural event in its own right. T-shirts bearing Bart Simpson's image appeared on virtually every body in America simultaneously, driven by a manufacturing and distribution surge that overwhelmed the official licensing operation and spawned an enormous underground market of unofficial merchandise that itself became a cultural phenomenon. Bart's face on a T-shirt was everywhere. The specific designs varied, but the most iconic showed Bart in a variety of poses with his catchphrases. "Don't have a cow, man," "Ay, caramba," "Eat my shorts," and the simple identification, "I'm Bart Simpson." "Who the hell are you?" This last phrase, presented on a T-shirt worn by a cartoon child, was itself a kind of cultural statement about attitude and disrespect that the show's critics had been warning about and that Bart's fans had been celebrating, compressed into 5 words that could be worn on a chest. The scale of the merchandise phenomenon was genuinely remarkable. By the end of 1990, The Simpsons had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in retail sales, a figure that has grown enormously in the years since. The show became, almost immediately, one of the most commercially valuable entertainment properties in the world, not primarily through its network ratings, which were strong but not extraordinary, but through its ability to generate consumer demand for physical objects bearing its characters' images. This commercial success had complex effects on the show itself. It provided resources that funded the production's ambitions. It created expectations and pressures that shaped what the show became. It established The Simpsons as a brand, with all the specific implications of that word, the need to protect and manage and extend the brand in ways that sometimes conflicted with the purely creative decisions the show's makers would otherwise have made. The brand also eventually worked against the show in ways that became more visible as the decades passed. When a show becomes a brand, the brand develops its own momentum, its own reasons for continuing that are separate from the creative reasons for continuing. The brand is always fresh even when the creative work has aged. The brand continues to reach new audiences, particularly young audiences, even when the longtime audience has moved on. The brand's needs and the creative work's needs can diverge significantly, and the show's later years reflect the specific ways in which those needs diverged. But in 1990 and 1991, the merchandise was not a complication. It was a confirmation. It confirmed the show had reached an audience that was not merely watching but was identifying, that the characters and their catchphrases and their specific visual identities had achieved the status of cultural icons in ways that most entertainment never achieves. The Simpsons had, within its first 2 seasons, gone from a new show on a fledgling network to a cultural reference point that people who had never watched a single episode recognized and had opinions about. The show's influence on other merchandise and other cultural products was significant and long-lasting. The model that The Simpsons demonstrated, of an animated family property that could generate commercial value across multiple product categories, while also being taken seriously as an artistic achievement, influenced how the entertainment industry thought about animated television more broadly. The combination of cultural credibility and commercial success that The Simpsons achieved changed expectations about what animated properties could be and do, not just creatively but commercially. The show also influenced, in ways that are harder to track but equally real, the visual vocabulary of American popular culture. The specific character designs of the Simpsons family, the specific yellow and the specific proportions, and the specific expressiveness of the animation entered the broader visual culture in ways that extended well beyond the show itself. The influence on graphic design, on illustration, on the visual language of advertising and branding and product design is diffuse but real. The Simpsons helped establish that cartoon characters could be simultaneously simple and iconic, could communicate personality and emotion through minimal lines, could be reproduced across different scales and different contexts and different media without losing their essential identity. This influence is part of what makes the show's legacy so difficult to fully measure. The direct effects, the shows it inspired, the conversations it prompted, the cultural discussions it shaped, are large enough to be significant. The indirect effects, the ways it altered the broader landscape of American visual and comedic culture, are larger still, diffuse enough to be impossible to quantify, but real enough to be felt in virtually every corner of contemporary American entertainment. Expansion, The Simpsons and the question of family. At its heart, across its entire run, The Simpsons is a show about what it means to be in a family, about the specific combination of obligation and love and irritation and need and dependence and devotion that constitutes the experience of being permanently connected to a specific group of people you did not choose. The show has always been clear that the family is not ideal. Homer is not an ideal father, Marge is not living the life she might have designed for herself, Bart is not a model student or a model citizen, Lisa is often miserable in a household and a community that does not understand her. Maggie is silent in ways that are sometimes unsettling and sometimes beautiful, and always suggestive of depths that no one around her is quite attending to. And yet the family is obviously the right family. It is the family that each member needs, flawed as the fit is, imperfect as the match between what each person needs and what each person can offer. Homer needs Marge's stability to keep him tethered to anything resembling responsible adulthood. Marge needs Homer's capacity for joy, his ability to find pleasure in simple things and to approach the world with an enthusiasm that her own more careful temperament would not generate on its own. Bart needs Lisa's seriousness as a counterweight to his own cheerful nihilism, even if he would never acknowledge this need. Lisa needs Bart's permission to be imperfect, his implicit argument that you do not have to be right about everything to be loved, even if she finds him maddening. And both of them need Homer in a way that is the show's most persistent and most moving argument. Homer is not a good father by most conventional measures. He is inattentive and selfish and frequently absent even when present, lost in his own needs and his own pleasures, in ways that leave his children to navigate their own difficulties without the guidance they should be able to count on. But Homer is also genuinely there in ways that matter more than the conventional measures acknowledge. He shows up. He cares. When it is important, when the chips are actually down and the family is actually threatened, Homer's love for his children is not in doubt and not deferred. It is real, and it is total, and it produces the occasional moments of genuine heroism that make the show's portrait of him something more than a portrait of failure. The show has made this argument most clearly in its best episodes, the episodes that earn their emotional moments by placing them in the context of genuine comedy and genuine failure, and then showing that the love survives both. Lisa's Substitute, the Season 2 episode in which Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher who seems to understand her in ways that no one else in her life does, ends with a letter that the teacher has left for Lisa before his departure, a letter that tells her, in terms that are direct and warm and entirely free of condescension, that her father loves her in ways that he cannot always express, that the inadequacy of the expression is not the same as the inadequacy of the feeling. Homer does not know about this letter. He does not know that his daughter was given a more articulate expression of his love by another man than he has ever managed to offer directly. He does not know that the gap between what he feels and what he communicates has been bridged, at least once, by someone who saw him clearly enough to tell his daughter what he could not say himself. And the scene that follows the letter, in which Homer picks Lisa up from school with his usual clueless cheerfulness, unaware of what has just happened, is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history. Because you watch Homer being exactly what he always is, and you know that this is insufficient, and you know that it is also, somehow, everything he has, and you know that Lisa, who has just received the translation of her father's love in terms she could understand, is watching him with new eyes. That is what the show is about. That gap between what people feel and what they can say. That gap between what people intend and what they achieve. That gap between the family you have and the family you might have designed, and the specific gift of finding, despite all the gaps, that the family you have is somehow the right one for you. This is not a sentimental position. The show does not pretend that the gaps do not matter. It does not resolve them into comfortable acceptance. It holds them open, acknowledges them, sometimes makes them the subject of the comedy, and then finds, in the midst of all the gaps and all the failures and all the ways in which this specific family does not quite work, the genuine love that makes it work anyway. That is what 36 years of The Simpsons amounts to. Not a record of perfection, a record of love in the presence of imperfection, which is the only kind of love that actually exists in Springfield or anywhere else. Expansion. Matt Groening in the decades after. The Man and the Institution. Matt Groening turned 70 in 2024. The show he created when he was 34 years old is still in production. The family he invented in a waiting room is still on the air every week. The yellow faces he sketched in under an hour before a meeting that changed his life have been reproduced on more objects and surfaces and screens than he could have imagined from that waiting room chair. Groening has spoken, in various interviews across the decades, about the specific quality of his relationship with the show in its later years, about what it means to be the creator of something that has developed a life of its own, that is maintained now by a large team of people across a complex industrial production operation that is in some ways no longer primarily his, in the sense that its daily creative decisions are not primarily his to make. He has consistently described himself as proud of the show, proud of what it became, proud of the sustained commitment to quality that the best of its episodes represent. He has also, occasionally, described the experience of watching episodes that he did not have a direct hand in making, episodes that feel more distant from the show he imagined than the early seasons did, with a mixture of equanimity and the specific kind of melancholy that comes from watching something you created grow beyond your control. He created Futurama in 1999, a science fiction animated series that drew on different aspects of his sensibility and that gave him a creative space that was wholly his own in a way that The Simpsons had not been for years. Futurama ran for 7 seasons across 2 networks and has been revived multiple times, evidence that the audience for Groening's specific sensibility extends beyond the Springfield-shaped container it first found, and that the things he finds interesting and funny and worth exploring are not exhausted by any single project. His relationship with Life in Hell, the strip that started everything, continued long after The Simpsons made him famous. He kept drawing it until 2012, when he ended the strip after a run of 32 years, the longest sustained solo cartooning effort by any cartoonist of his generation. The strip's ending was not announced in advance. It simply stopped, and in the final strip, Groening drew Binky the rabbit looking directly at the reader and saying goodbye in the specific way that someone who has been talking to you for a very long time says goodbye. The end of Life in Hell was, in some ways, the end of the part of Groening's creative life that belonged entirely to him, the part that was not institutional or commercial or subject to the decisions of other people, that was simply a man making a drawing and sending it out into the world without asking anyone's permission or meeting anyone's expectations. He had been doing that since 1977. He stopped in 2012. And The Simpsons, the thing that had grown from the strip and had eventually eclipsed it in every measurable way, continued. He is, by the accounts of people who have known him across the decades, a person who has navigated the specific challenges of enormous creative success with more grace than most. He has not, apparently, become the person that enormous success often makes, the person who confuses their reputation with their worth, who surrounds themselves with agreement, who loses the specific quality of self-awareness that made the original work valuable. He remains curious. He remains genuinely amused by things. He remains, by all accounts, someone who is interested in the world rather than primarily interested in how the world regards him. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the specific quality that made the show possible in the first place. The sketchbook and the sensibility and the middle child's ability to watch the room without needing to be the center of it. The ability to find the funny edge of things without needing the things to be arranged for your comfort. The pleasure in observation that is its own reward. Regardless of whether the observation leads anywhere, Groening found a way to make a living from that pleasure. He found a way to share it with hundreds of millions of people. And the thing he shared turned out to be, in ways that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted from that waiting room chair, the longest-running animated series in the history of American television, a cultural institution, a family that belongs to everyone who has ever sat on a couch and watched them stumble through the door. Not bad for a rabbit with worried eyes and a sketchbook full of half-formed ideas. Not bad at all. Expansion. The show's relationship to time and why nothing ever changes. There is a quality that The Simpsons has that almost no other television show in history has, and that quality is permanence. Not the permanence of an archived work that can be revisited, though it has that too, but the permanence of an ongoing presence, a show that is still being made and still being broadcast and still reaching new audiences even as its older audiences have moved through entire stages of their lives since they first sat down to watch it. This permanence creates a specific kind of temporal experience for the longtime viewer. You watch Homer struggle with the same problems he has always struggled with. You watch Bart face the same disciplinary consequences he has always faced. You watch Lisa press the same arguments she has always pressed, against the same resistance she has always encountered. And the watching, especially after many years, has a quality that is not quite nostalgia and not quite familiarity, but something between the two, a sense of returning to something that was always here, that has always been here, that will continue to be here in a way that very little else in your life will. The characters do not age. This is the most discussed formal quality of the show, the floating timeline that keeps Bart perpetually 10 and Lisa perpetually 8 and Homer perpetually in his mid-30s. It is discussed as a convention, as a storytelling device, as a production necessity, as a formal quality that has both advantages and costs. All of these framings are accurate, but there is another way to understand it that is less discussed and more interesting. The characters do not age because the show is not about progress. It is not about the movement through time that most narrative is implicitly organized around. The movement from innocence to experience, from ignorance to understanding, from childhood to adulthood, from disorder to resolution. The Simpsons is organized around something else, around the recurring experience of a specific kind of life, rather than the progressive experience of moving through stages of it. Homer is not going to become a better father. He will have episodes in which he is a better father, episodes in which the genuine love he has for his children produces genuine acts of care and sacrifice and attention. And then the next episode will begin, and he will be exactly the same Homer he was before. The same distance between his intentions and his performance. The same gap between the father he wants to be and the father he is. This is not a failure of the show's characterization. It is the show's central argument about what ordinary human life is actually like. People do not make permanent progress. They cycle. They have good periods and bad periods. They improve in some areas and regress in others. They face the same challenges in different forms across many years and find them both more familiar and no easier to navigate. This is the structure of adult life for most people, and it is the structure of the show, and the correspondence between the two is one of the reasons the show resonates with adult viewers in a way that most entertainment does not. The reset that happens between episodes, the way that catastrophic events leave no permanent mark, the way that consequences do not accumulate across the show's run in the way that real consequences accumulate across real lives, has always been read as a limitation, as evidence of lazy writing or the constraints of episodic television. But it can also be read as something more intentional, as a representation of the way that the human capacity for recovery, for returning to baseline, for finding the familiar amid the chaotic, is itself one of the most fundamental human qualities. People recover. Communities recover, families recover, not because the damage was not real, not because the catastrophe did not happen, but because the alternative to recovery is dissolution. And most people, most families, most communities choose recovery even at the cost of the pretense that nothing significant happened. Springfield chooses this constantly, automatically, almost without reflection. And the show's willingness to let this be true, to allow the characters and the town to simply go on without the accumulated weight of everything that has happened to them, is a formal equivalent of the specific human capacity for resilience that makes continued life possible. This does not mean that nothing matters in Springfield. It means that what matters is not the events but the relationships, not the catastrophes but the connections, not the accumulated history, but the ongoing present tense fact of people who are connected to each other and who continue to show up for each other even when the showing up is imperfect and the connections are strained and the history between them is complicated. Homer and Marge have been married for over 30 years of showtime. They have faced infidelity, temptations, and financial crises and professional failures and near deaths and natural disasters and all the ordinary indignities of a shared life, and they are still married. Not because they have resolved the tensions between them, not because Homer has become the husband Marge deserves, or Marge has found a way to be fully satisfied with the husband she has, but because the connection between them is real, and the love between them is real, and the accumulated history of a shared life, however imperfect, is its own form of wealth. The show returns to this again and again, in episodes that dramatize the difficulty of the marriage alongside the genuine love within it, and the consistent message is not that love conquers all or that everything works out, but that the specific combination of imperfection and love that characterizes this particular marriage is itself something worth having and worth protecting. This is a more complicated and more honest argument than most television makes about marriage and family. It does not promise that everything will be fine. It argues that what you have, however inadequate by some theoretical standard, is worth caring for, because the alternative is not a better version of the same thing but a different thing entirely, and the different thing might be worse. The Simpson family, in their yellow house on Evergreen Terrace in their impossible town, are a family that has chosen each other repeatedly across the decades, not through any deliberate decision, but through the simple accumulation of continued presence, continued showing up, continued being there for each other in all the imperfect ways they know how. This is what family is, the show argues. Not a state of ideal connection, but a practice of continued connection in the absence of ideal conditions. And that practice, that continued showing up, that continued choosing of each other, even in the full knowledge of each other's failures and limitations and specific difficult qualities, is what the show has been depicting every week since January of 1990, and what it will continue to depict for as long as it runs, and what it will leave behind as its most enduring gift when it finally ends. A family that keeps choosing each other, a couch that is always there to come back to, a living room where the light is always on and the door is always open, and the people inside have been waiting, unchanged, for as long as you needed to be away. That is Springfield. That is The Simpsons. And that is what you are carrying with you as you close your eyes tonight. Whether you have been watching the show for decades or you heard about it for the first time right now. The image of a family in a yellow house on a street called Evergreen Terrace, stubbornly, cheerfully, imperfectly continuing, because continuing is what they do. Sleep well. It is a long way back to Portland from here, but the sketchbook is still open. End of script. 11 Labs production notes. Final word count approximately 40,000 plus words. Recommended total runtime at 125 words per minute, approximately 5.5 hours. Suitable for splitting into multiple episodes at natural section breaks. Each section heading represents a clean cut point. The closing reflection in the final expansion block should be read at the slowest pace of the entire recording, approximately 100 words per minute, with extended pauses between paragraphs. Final reflection. On staying and on watching. There is something that happens when you watch a show for a very long time that does not happen with any other kind of entertainment. The show begins to feel less like a thing you are watching and more like a relationship you are maintaining, less like content and more like correspondence. A regular exchange between something that was made with care and you, who are receiving it with whatever you have to bring on any given evening. The Simpsons has been that kind of correspondence for a lot of people. Not all of them, and not consistently across the full run of the show, but for many viewers across many years, the weekly engagement with the show has had that quality of ongoing relationship, of a thing you return to not only because it is good, but because it is yours now, in the specific way that anything you have stayed with for a long time becomes yours. This is one of the more under-examined aspects of the show's longevity, the way that time itself transforms the experience of watching it. The first time you see an episode, you are watching it. After you have seen it several times across many years, you are inhabiting it, living briefly in a world you know well, visiting people you have known a long time. The humor is still there, but the humor is no longer the primary thing. The primary thing is the specific quality of the familiar, the specific comfort of returning to something that has not changed even as you have changed, that was waiting for you exactly as you left it. Homer and Marge sitting on their couch, Bart running through the door, Lisa at her saxophone, Maggie with her pacifier, the opening notes of the theme, the couch gag, the same town, the same house, the same family. You know all of it. You have always known all of it, and knowing it, being able to anticipate it, being able to settle into it the way you settle into anything known and trusted, is itself a form of pleasure that does not diminish with repetition, but deepens. This is the gift the show gives its longest-term viewers, the people who have been watching since the beginning and who are still watching now. Not novelty, comfort. The specific comfort of a world that is always there, always itself, always willing to let you in. The world is not always there. People leave and places change, and the things you love do not always stay. But Springfield stays, Homer stays, the couch stays. And when you need it, when you need a world that is reliably itself, that will meet you where you are without asking anything more of you than presence, it is there. It has always been there. Matt Groening drew a family in a waiting room and gave them the street name from his childhood and his father's name and his mother's hair and a town that could be anywhere, and the family found their way into the hearts of people all around the world and stayed there for 36 years and counting. That is not a small thing. That is, measured in the terms that actually matter, which are not ratings or revenue or cultural influence, but the specific number of evenings that were made a little better by the presence of this family in this show, one of the larger things that American entertainment has ever produced. Bart is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Homer still stumbles through the door at the end of a long day at the plant. Marge is still there to meet him. The couch is still there. It always will be. Addendum: the town nobody can leave. There is a running joke in The Simpsons that Springfield is a town nobody can leave. Various episodes have depicted characters attempting to move away or escape or simply leave town for any reason, only to find themselves returning to Springfield by the episode's end through circumstances that range from improbable to impossible. The joke is funny. It is also, if you let yourself think about it, a fairly accurate description of the experience of being a longtime viewer of the show. You cannot leave Springfield. Once you have spent enough time there, it goes with you. The specific rhythms of its comedy, the specific cadences of its characters' voices, the specific texture of its world, become part of how you experience other things. You see something absurd in the news, and your first thought is that it sounds like a Simpsons episode. You hear someone speak with a particular combination of blustering confidence and complete ignorance, and you hear Homer in it. You meet someone with the specific quality of earnest goodness that the world consistently fails to reward, and you see Ned Flanders in them. This is what deep familiarity with a creative work does. It provides you with a vocabulary, a set of references and images and ways of understanding experience that you apply to new experiences as they arrive. Every book you have read deeply enough, and every film you have seen enough times, and every show you have watched across enough years, contributes to this vocabulary. The Simpsons contributes to it for a lot of people in a lot of ways, because the show has been describing a particular kind of American experience for a very long time, and doing it with enough specificity and enough humanity that the descriptions stick. When Homer makes a bad decision and immediately regrets it and then makes an even worse decision in an attempt to correct the first one, you recognize it not only as Homer but as a pattern you have seen in your own life and in the lives of people around you. When Lisa is right about something important and nobody listens, you recognize it not only as Lisa but as an experience you have had and observed and felt the specific frustration of. When Marge holds everything together through a combination of patience and love, and the specific kind of quiet heroism that goes unrecognized because it is too constant and too domestic to attract the notice that dramatic heroism receives, you recognize it not only as Marge but as a quality you have seen in real people and perhaps in yourself. This recognition, multiplied across hundreds of episodes and millions of viewers, is the show's true legacy, not the ratings, not the merchandise, not the cultural influence or the predictions or the awards or the records. The recognition, the specific experience of watching something and feeling seen, of encountering a reflection of human experience that is both funny and honest, that does not require you to be anyone other than who you are to understand it. That is what Matt Groening made when he sat down in that waiting room and drew 5 rough characters on a piece of paper. He made a mirror that was also a window. He made a world that was also a description of the world. He made a family that was also, in the specific way that the best fictional families always are, a way of understanding what families are and why they matter, and what it costs to maintain them and what it would cost not to. 36 years, almost 800 episodes, one impossible town, one yellow family on one familiar couch on one street whose name you already know. Evergreen Terrace. It was always going to be called that. And that is the story. All of it, or as much of it as fits in one night. The rest is still being written, still being produced, still being broadcast every Sunday evening on Fox. The show goes on. The family endures. And somewhere, in a waiting room somewhere, There is perhaps another young cartoonist sitting with a sketchbook and a head full of characters that have not yet found their form, drawing in the margins of whatever else they were supposed to be doing, making the rough first sketches of something that will eventually matter to more people than they can currently imagine. The story does not end in Springfield. It just pauses there for a while, in the warmth of the living room light, while everyone is still together, while the kids are still young, while the night is still long enough to hold everything worth saying. Rest now. The couch is soft, the room is warm, and if you listen closely, just beneath the sound of this voice fading into quiet, you might still be able to hear it. The theme music, starting again.